Peppermint Pig by Nina Bawden. Read by Lindsay Duncan. Old Granny Greengrass had her finger chopped off in the butcher's when she was buying half a leg of lamb. She had pointed to a place where she wanted her joint to be cut, but then she decided she needed a bigger piece and pointed again. Unfortunately, Mr. Grummet, the butcher, was already bringing his sharp chopper down. He chopped straight through her finger, and it flew like a snapped twig into a pile of sawdust in the corner of the shop. It was hard to tell who was more surprised, Granny Greengrass or the butcher. But she didn't blame him. She said, "I could never make up my mind and stick to it, Mr. Grummet. That's always been my trouble." Of course, I can't be certain Granny Greengrass said this, because she died so long ago, years and years before I was born, before there were motor cars on the streets, or electricity in the houses, or aeroplanes in the sky. But my grandmother, Emily Greengrass, told me she said it, and I believe her, as her children, Poll and Theo, and Lily and George, always believed her. Emily Greengrass was very good at telling stories. Most of her best ones were about the town in Norfolk, where she was born and lived until she grew up and married James Greengrass and moved into London. There was one famous tale about a poor swineherd whose pigs had died and whose wife and children were starving. He was in despair until one night a monk appeared to him in a dream and told him that if he dug under a certain oak tree, he would find a chest of gold buried there. Poll and Theo had enjoyed this story when they were younger, but now they preferred to hear about Granny Greengrass, whose finger had been chopped off by Grummet the butcher. It was more interesting than a fairy story, partly because they were, naturally, a bloodthirsty pair. Not that they looked it. Poll was 9 years old, with a soft, rosy face, and long yellow hair the colour of duckling's down, and although Theo was 10.5, most people thought he was younger than Poll because he was so small and thin. About as thick through as a darning needle was how their mother, who was a dressmaker, always described him, and his delicate features and wide, shy blue eyes made him look to anyone who didn't know him as innocent as a baby angel. But it was Theo who said, when their mother told them the story about Granny Greengrass for about the 100th time one dark November afternoon, "What happened afterwards? Did it spout blood?" "No, it was a clean cut," Mother said. "Hardly a drop spilled, or no more than when you bite off a young puppy's tail, or so your Aunt Sarah said. She was there, you know, but not much help by the sound of it. What she should have done was sew it back on, but Sarah was never very practical." She gave a faint sniff. "Though clever at her school books, of course." Poll said, "What do you mean about biting off puppies' tails?" "That's what the groom at the manor house used to do. My mother was cook there, you know. I've seen that groom pick up a new litter, one after the other, bite off the tail at the joint, and spit it out quick as a flash. Kindest way, he always said, no fuss and taradiddle, and barely a squeak from the pup." Poll squeaked herself at this thought, and Lily, who was rising 14, closed her eyes and moaned softly. George, a year older, cleared his throat, pushed his glasses up on his nose, and slammed his book shut. He thought he was too old for his mother's stories now, and had been pretending not to listen. Poll and Theo enjoyed dreadful tales because their own lives were so comfortable. Nothing dreadful had ever happened to them, nor ever seemed likely to. How could it? Their family's solid brick villa in a leafy suburb of London was the sort people think of when they say safe as houses, and there was plenty of money to keep them warm and well-fed inside it. Their father was a coach painter in the firm of Rowland and Son, and his special job was to paint coats of arms on the doors of rich people's carriages. This was delicate work, and he was paid £3 10s a week, which was a good wage at the time, enough for their mother to employ a young maid called Ruby to help with the housework, and for the girls to have real lace on their drawers, and Theo a green velvet suit for best, with lace on the collar. They had more important things, too. A lively young mother and a tall, handsome father who took them out every Sunday to Kew or to Hampton Court, and sometimes on Sundays to a fair or a carnival, or to the theatre to see Dan Leno the clown, or the Siamese twins, joined back to back like two stiff little dolls, each playing a xylophone. He was always bringing them presents, and not ordinary presents either. He used gold leaf for the coats of arms on the carriages, and sometimes he brought home small leftover slivers for his children to make Christmas cards with. The week before the dreadful thing happened, the thing that was to change their whole lives forever, he had brought home a tinful, tiny scrapings of real yellow gold, thin as tissue. Poll was the naughtiest one of the family, and the dreadful thing happened on one of her naughty days, a dark day of thick mustardy fog that had specks of grit in it she could taste on her tongue. Theo was not allowed out because of his delicate chest, and by the time Poll got home from school she was already angry. She had been in a cold classroom all day, some of the time stuck in the corner with the dunce's cap on, made of green drawing paper and smelling of gum, while Mother and Theo had been cosy at home, sharing secrets. She was naughty at tea. Children were expected to behave well in those days, and although Emily Greengrass was less strict in some ways than most mothers, she was firm about table manners. That afternoon, Poll had to be told once too often. Her mother said, "I've had enough, my girl. Under the table." Poll didn't mind. She had eaten as much as she wanted, and with a good tea inside her, it was pleasant under the table. That starched white cloth hung down almost to the floor, making a good private place where she could behave as she liked and no one to see. Someone, George probably, he was always kind to Poll when she was punished, had pushed a small green hassock under the table and she rested her head on it. She didn't go to sleep properly, just dozed off and on, listening to the voices above her head and watching the feet round the table through the furry fringe of her lashes. She must have slept in the end, because suddenly her father's boots were where George's had been, and his voice was saying, "I am so sorry about this, Emily dear." Poll was awake at once. Father usually said "Mother," but perhaps what startled her most was the tone of his voice, which was hoarse and slow, as if some of the gritty fog had got into his throat and stayed there. He said, "Whoever took the money, I was in charge and must be responsible. I should have locked the safe up before I left the office to speak to my father." "Oh, I knew he would bring us all down one day," Mother said, and Poll wondered who she was talking about. Dad had said, "My father," but Grandpa Greengrass was dead. She listened, puzzled and yawning. Father said, "It's not his fault, Emily. Poor old fellow, if you could see him." There was a question in his voice. Mother said, "No, thank you. We can't afford two soft hearts in this family. Did young Rowland know he'd been hanging about?" "I'm afraid so." "And accused him, I suppose. Is that it, James? You were afraid he'd send for the police?" Father said, very slowly and reluctantly, Yes, I'll admit that I was afraid of that, even though I was fairly sure young Rowland was just covering up for himself. He was the only one who was ever alone in the office with the safe open. But it was his word against mine, wasn't it? "Old Roland would take your word, James," Mother said. "And you know it." "Perhaps. In a way, that's the point. The lad's future was in my hands, and he knew it. He stood there denying what we both knew he'd done, blaming the old man and threatening to send for the police, but with such a look in his eyes, begging me not to give him away to his father, and I couldn't, Emily. A boy barely 19 with his whole life before him. I can start afresh, Emily. Young Roland can't. It's his family's firm, and he'll have to take over one day." "You have 4 children, James." Mother's voice was still cold as winter. "Shouldn't you consider them, too?" Father said, "It would be terrible for them to have a father they couldn't look up to, one who'd done something he believed to be wrong." "Yes," Mother said. "Yes, I suppose it might be." "What will you do, James?" "Something different, I think. Not coach building, that's had its day. In 20 years, Emily, there will hardly be any horse-drawn traffic left on the roads. Everyone will have motor cars." "I'll believe that when I see it," Mother said, and gave one of her sniffs. "I thought I might go to America." Mother said, "James!" And Paul cried out under the table. "Dad!" she said. "Dad!" fighting her way through the stiff folds of the starched cloth that covered her head, blinding her. Father lifted the cloth, scooped her up, and held her against him. Mother's face was white under her short red-brown curls, and her pretty mouth was buttoned up tight like her tight-buttoned bodice. She was sitting poker straight and staring at Paul. Paul looked at her, then at her father, who was stroking his dark, silky moustache and watching her gravely. She said, "Why is Dad going away?" Neither of them spoke. "What's happened?" she shouted, stamping her foot. "Tell me this minute." "Your father has left his job because there's been trouble in the firm. Money stolen. Not by him, that goes without saying, but for his own, no doubt very good reasons, he has taken the blame for it." She turned to her father. "Are you really going away to America?" "I think so, my little love. Your Uncle Edmund is there, as you know, working on his fruit farm in California. I shall join him to start with. After that, who knows? America is a land of great opportunities. I may make a fortune." "If you go away, what will happen to us?" "Nothing, my pretty Paul. I'll send for you when I'm established, of course. Until then, you will go to my sisters, your Aunt Sarah and your Aunt Harriet, in Norfolk." And so it turned out to be. A week later, the 4 children travelled to Norfolk alone. Mother said it would be easier to clear up the house with them out of the way, and she and Father would follow as soon as they could. Until then, the aunts would look after them. "Be good now," Mother said. "Your Aunt Sarah has very high standards." Aunt Sarah met them when they changed trains at Norwich. Almost dark then, it was quite dark when they reached the town, and the first interesting thing they saw when they came out of the station was a brightly lit butcher's shop, decorated for Christmas with holly and a crib in one window, and a live monster in the other. Grummet's Christmas beast, a great bullock with bloodshot eyes and tight dark curls between fierce curving horns, stamping about in his pen and blowing out foggy breath. "Poor creature," Lily said. "I think it's dreadful to put him on show when he'll be killed before Christmas." "Silly Lily," George said. "You eat meat, don't you?" Poll and Theo were enchanted, not only by the beast, but by the chance to press their noses against the window and peer at the very same butcher who had chopped off their grandmother's finger. "Is it the same one, Aunt Sarah?" Theo asked. "You were there, weren't you?" He looked at Sarah hopefully. "Shut up," George muttered, looking anxiously at Aunt Sarah. She was tall like Lily, and as solemnly pretty. Her high, handsome forehead, usually smooth as pale silk, was crinkled now with shock or distress. She said, "I'm surprised you know about that." "My poor mother." "No, it's not the same butcher, dear. He passed on some years ago. Look at the pretty crib, children. Grummet always makes a beautiful Christmas crib." Theo and Poll inspected the crib without enthusiasm. When they moved on up the street, George held Poll and Theo back and whispered, "Keep your big mouths quiet, will you? Aunt Sarah's nice, but she doesn't like blood and guts talk." "I don't care," Theo said. "She's niminy-piminy." "Well, then, it's not fair to Mother. Aunt Sarah will think—" "Think what?" But George was still hesitating. As they passed under a street lamp, Poll and Theo saw his face, screwed up and bothered. At last he said, "Oh, never mind. But you know Mother hates being what she calls beholden to people. Well, we're beholden to Aunt Sarah now." Aunt Sarah had turned back and was calling, "Come along. We're nearly there, children." There was a line of neat brick cottages built in a terrace. Aunt Sarah said, "This is our house, and the one next door is where you are going to live. Aunt Harriet has set tea for you there. We thought it would be nice for you to have tea in your own home after your journey." The door was open. Aunt Sarah led them through a short, dark, narrow passage to a back room, lit by a brass oil lamp with a white shade hanging above a round table. The room was so small, and the table so big, that they had to edge round it to kiss Aunt Harriet when she appeared at the door of the scullery. "Come in, my chicks, welcome home," Aunt Harriet cried. She was as tall as Aunt Sarah, but her face was brick red and bony instead of soft and pale, and she had sharp, merry eyes, crow-footed with smiling. She hugged them all hard till they gasped. Theo said, "Where's the bathroom?" "If you want to pay a visit," Aunt Sarah said, "the closet is out in the yard. Take a candle, and there are washstands upstairs. Hang your coats in the passage and go out to wash before tea." Aunt Harriet took Theo out through the scullery. Aunt Sarah led the others upstairs. There were 2 doors at the top, one at each side of the stairs. "Theo and George will sleep in the back bedroom," Aunt Sarah said. "Your mother in the front and Poll in the box room. Lily will stay next door with Harriet and me. Is that all right, Lily? Don't you mind being apart from the others?" "Oh, no," Lily said. "I'd like that, Aunt Sarah." Poll was surprised that she sounded so eager, but Aunt Sarah looked pleased. She touched Lily's cheek gently. The flame of the candle bent in the draught and grew tall, filling the front room with huge shadows. Aunt Sarah opened a low door down 2 steps in the corner and said, "Here is your room, Poll, my dear." It was tiny. An old iron bed, a chest of drawers under the window, and a tin bath hanging on the back of the door. "Big enough for a little one," Aunt Sarah said, smiling. She left them alone. Lily and Poll washed in cold water and dried on a rough, sweet-smelling towel. Poll whispered, "It's a little house, isn't it? Our house in London was huge. Where will Ruby sleep?" Lily said, "Shh," and glanced over her shoulder. She whispered back, "Ruby's not coming." George was scrubbing his face with the flannel. He put out his hand for the towel and said, "We can't afford a maid now. Don't be stupid, Poll." They went downstairs. Aunt Harriet sat in front of the fire, skirt hitched to the heat, making toast with a 3-pronged brass fork. There was toast and dripping for tea, potato cakes with golden syrup, and fat, sticky biscuits full of caraway seeds. Aunt Sarah poured tea. It was very weak, the kind of tea Mother called water bewitched. Poll thought of saying this, then counted 10 and decided she'd better not mention it. She looked at her aunts. Aunt Sarah had a sweet, gentle face, but it was somehow stern, too. Aunt Harriet's face was much jollier. She had thin hair, fine as spider's thread, twisted up in a skimpy bun on top of her head, and a loud, abrupt laugh like a man's. Impossible to imagine Aunt Sarah laughing, Poll thought. It would make her face too untidy. But she smiled at them all with great kindness. she said, "we must discuss your education, children. I expect the first thing you will all want to know is where you are going to school." It was the last thing Poll wanted to know, but when she had counted to 10, she knew she had better not say so. She munched toast and dripping and sighed. Aunt Sarah said, "George will go to the grammar school, of course, Theo to the boys' school just round the corner, and Poll to my school." Aunt Sarah was headmistress of the girls' school, and Aunt Harriet taught there as well. Aunt Sarah said, "It is Lily we must think about. What do you want to be when you grow up, my dear?" "Mother thinks I should be a nurse, or go into the post office. But I would like to be an actress, really." Lily blushed. "It is my greatest wish." Poll was astonished to hear her say this to Aunt Sarah. It always made Mother angry. But Aunt Sarah was smiling. "That is a fine ambition, Lily. You get it from your father, of course. He was always so fond of the theatre. There is a private school in Norwich with a good reputation for drama. Perhaps we can manage to send you there." Aunt Harriet laughed her loud, cheerful laugh. "And what about Theo here? He's not going to come to much if he doesn't eat more. 1 potato cake and half of that left on his plate. No wonder he looks pale as lard." "I'm not hungry," Theo said. "You need a good purge, my boy. A good dose. That'll bring the colour back into your cheeks. Senna tea or prune paste, which would you rather have?" Theo shook his head, looking as if he might be sick any minute. "Not tonight, Harriet," Aunt Sarah said. "The boy needs his sleep more than anything. They all do." "I'm not tired," Poll said, though she was. So tired suddenly that she could barely keep her eyes open. Too tired to protest when Lily led her upstairs and helped her undress in that strange little room with the tin bath on the back of the door that looked like a humpy whale in the candlelight. "It's like going to bed in a cupboard," she said, when Lily tucked her up and kissed her good night. It was only their 4th day in Norfolk, but they had done so many things it seemed they had been there for weeks. Aunt Sarah had taken them on a tour of the town, shown them the assembly rooms, the wide paved market square, the beautiful church with a roof that was full of flying wooden angels, and the family graves in the churchyard. Mother's parents were buried there, and old Granny Greengrass. Theo asked, "Where's Grandpa Greengrass?" But Aunt Sarah didn't answer. Aunt Sarah was all duty, Aunt Harriet all temper and fun. She bought hoops for the 2 younger children, a wooden hoop for Poll, and an iron one with a hook called a skimmer for Theo. "Wooden hoops are for girls, iron hoops for boys. Don't ask me why," Aunt Harriet said. The day they met Mrs. Bug, they had bowled their hoops for miles, Aunt Harriet breathless behind them, and were crossing the square on their way home, dusty and happy and hungry for tea. Mrs. Marigold Bug was tall, the same thickness through from shoulders to knees. As she came towards them, she seemed to sway rather than walk, with a boneless, wavy motion that made Poll think of a caterpillar. Aunt Harriet took Poll's hand and quickened her step, and Poll had the feeling she would have marched them straight past without speaking if Mrs. Bug had not said, "Good afternoon, Miss Harriet. What remarkably mild weather we're having." Aunt Harriet stopped. They talked for a minute about the warm weather. Then Mrs. Bug said, "So, these are poor Emily's little ones." She gave Poll and Theo a smile that had no friendliness in it. "Your mother and I are old friends. It broke my heart to hear of her trouble." Aunt Harriet said, "This is Mrs. Bug, children. She and your mother were dressmaking apprentices together." Mrs. Bug weaved her head backwards and forwards. Poll thought, not a caterpillar, a snake that is going to strike. The snake hissed, "Poor little Fatherless things. It was Theo who spoke. We're not fatherless, Mrs. Bug. My father is going to America to make his fortune. Mrs. Bug's thin, pale lips smiled as if she knew better. She said, in a voice that tried to be sad, but had a gleeful sound running through it like a stream bubbling. Poor, brave little boy. Poor Emily, too. How will she bear it? She was always so proud, and it must be a worry, Miss Harriet, for you and your sister. All this on your plate when you've had enough there already. I would never have believed James would do such a thing. But I suppose blood will out. Poll looked at Aunt Harriet hopefully, expecting her to be rude back, as she could be when roused. But although her aunt's pulled-down mouth showed her temper, there was no sign of it in her voice. Sarah and I are only too glad to have James's children living so close for a while. It will be a sad day for us when he sends for them to go to America. Do you really think that he will? Aunt Harriet laughed as if this was a ridiculous question not worth an answer, and said, It's nice to talk, Marigold, but I mustn't keep the children hanging about. They'll get cold. I hope your father is well, and young Noah. I thought he looked poorly last time I saw him, as if he was outgrowing his strength. She didn't wait after that, but swept the children away, walking so fast that they had to run to keep up with her, and not slowing down until Theo tugged at her coat sleeve and gasped, Aunt Harry, what did she mean? Blood will out. Aunt Harriet said, Oh, she's a silly, sour creature. Don't bother your head with her blather. She couldn't never have been Mother's friend, Poll said. She's too mean, and she's old. Only a couple of years older than your mother. If she looks more, it's because she's had a hard time of it. Husband and 2 babies dead of consumption, only Noah left now. But you're right. She and your mother were never friends, really. Especially not after your mother and father were married. Marigold would have liked James herself. That's the truth of it. But he barely knew she existed. The day of the wedding, she went to her bed for a month and refused to get up until her father took a strap to her. After that, she quite lost her looks. Not that they were all that much to begin with. They said nothing. When Aunt Harriet looked and sounded this way, it was best to keep quiet, or else change the subject. Poll said in an affected, surprised voice, Look! There's Lily! Without her coat on! Lily was running towards them, pinafore fluttering, copper curls bouncing. There you are! Where have you been all this time? Mother and Father have come. They've been here simply ages. Father's boat was sailing on Christmas Eve. Only 2 days away, but they would have all tomorrow together. He made it seem like a long, lovely holiday. We'll do a grand tour, he said. See all there is to see. Hire a trap from the Angel and do things in style. And as the church clock struck 10, he was there at the door with a smartly painted trap and a shiny black pony. They were all dressed in their best. As the trap rattled along, a little breeze blew back the sweet leathery smell of well-polished harness and the dusty, warm, oily smell of the pony. To Poll's ear, his hooves beat out the tune, Father is going away tomorrow. Father is going away. The town square was bustling with people. Father and Mother greeted those that they knew, bowing to right and to left, as if they were royalty. There's old Mr. Mullin I used to work for. Stop the trap, dear. We can't pass without speaking, and he will be interested to know you're off to America. They had heard about old Mr. Mullin, who kept a general store and employed several girls to make dresses for his customers in a big room above it. A slave driver, Mother had called him, a wicked old devil. But he looked a meek, harmless man with a pink, knobbly nose and a mole on his chin that had several black hairs growing out of it. He said, Business hasn't been the same since you left, Mrs. Greengrass. 16 years ago, and Lady March still says no one can fit a dress as you did. Mother pursed her lips to stop herself smiling. Well, I'll have to see, Mr. Mullin. It's early days yet. These 4 young ones keep me busy, you know, so I can't promise anything. Don't overdo it, Mother, Lily said, when Mr. Mullin had lifted his hat and walked on, or he'll think you don't want to work for him. "He'll pay me better if he thinks I don't need it," Mother said. "I know the old rascal. And that Lady March means to sticks, not only with money, never a word of praise to your face." Father laughed. "Plenty behind your back, though, it seems. And you look pleased about it, so don't pretend not to be." "It's nice to be remembered," Mother said smugly. Poll said, "Look, there's that Mrs. Bug, Theo." She was coming towards them with her strange swaying walk, a tall boy beside her. Mother said, "Wait, James, we can't drive off now. She'll think we're cutting her. I must have a word with the poor soul, if only a minute." Mrs. Bug had called Mother poor, Poll remembered. Poor Emily. But Mother had sounded kind. Mrs. Bug hadn't. She put her hand on the side of the trap. She looked at Mother with her pinpoint green eyes. Then at Father she said, "So you're leaving the country, James?" Father smiled. "On business, Mrs. Bug. How are you keeping? And Noah?" Noah was a long, rangy boy with a small head and small ears like his mother. His eyes were green too, but larger and lighter, like ripe dessert gooseberries. Mrs. Bug said, "Speak up, Noah." He said, "Mornin'," and hung his head. Mother said, in an encouraging voice, "Noah must be the same age as Theo. I remember when Sarah came to stay after Theo was born, she said you just had a boy. They'll be in the same form at school, I expect. Do you like school, Noah?" He looked up at her through his long lashes and tittered. Mrs. Bug said, "He and your Theo don't look the same age, though. You'd hardly credit it, really, my great boy and your little pale fellow. You must have been worried sick many a time, wondering if you were going to rear him." Noah tittered again, hand in front of his mouth, gooseberry eyes watching Theo, who turned away, pretending not to be listening. "Theo's small, but he's strong. He'll grow when he's ready," Mother said. "You still working at Mullen's, Marigold?" "I'm afraid I have to nowadays," Mrs. Bug said. "In my position, I can't afford to laugh at old Mullen any more than I can afford to dress up to the nines every day and go swanking about in a carriage." After that, although they all talked and laughed a great deal as the trap rattled through country lanes, the fat pony's feet going pat, pat, pat in the dust, it was only to keep each other's spirits up. Mrs. Bug had made them feel foolish, as if it was showing off to dress up in their best clothes and parade through the town when it wasn't a Sunday, and all 4 children were glad when the expedition was over and Father set them down at their door. The cottages had long, thin gardens at the back. Their front doors opened onto the market square. Kneeling on the slippery sofa was rather like having a permanent seat at the theatre, because something was always happening outside the window. The week after Christmas, a man with his dancing bear appeared in the square. Someone had given the bear beer to drink, and he stood on his hind legs, waving his great black head and swaying from side to side like a drunken sailor. Lily said it was cruel to give a poor bear alcohol, but Poll and Theo thought he seemed happy enough and went outside to take a closer look. As they slammed their front door, the station cab drew up, and a short, fat man got out of it. Poll glanced at him and ran round the back of the cab. Theo caught hold of her pinafore. He whispered, "Poll, who's that man?" She answered absently, watching the bear, who had little red eyes and long, cruel-looking claws like steel rakes. "I don't know. Oh, yes, I do. It's old Roland, I think. Oh, I am glad he's wearing a muzzle." Theo said, "What?" And she laughed. "I mean the bear, silly." "Poll?" He sounded so shocked that she dragged her eyes away from the bear. Theo's face had gone white. He said, "Go and talk to him, Poll. I'll warn Mother." She said, "Hello, Mr. Roland." And he looked down at her, his fat neck rolling in red bristly folds over his collar. Something about him was different, but she couldn't think what. He said, "Why, it's James's little maid, isn't it? Pretty, Poll. Is your mother in?" The front door opened. Mother stood there, rather flushed, one hand touching her hair. Old Roland said, "May I come in, Mrs. Greengrass?" He had taken his hat off and was holding it in front of him, looking humble. Mother nodded and stepped back. She said, "Poll, take Mr. Rowland into the front room while I make tea." Old Rowland stood aside to let Poll go first through the door, as if she were a lady. He looked round the room, then at Poll. He said, "Shall we look out of the window? It's a long time since I've seen a dancing bear." He stood beside Poll while she knelt on the sofa and pressed her nose against the cold glass. The bear was on 4 legs now, shambling beside his owner, who was going round with his cap. The audience was dwindling rapidly. Poll said, "I do think it's mean of people to go away without paying, don't you?" Old Rowland didn't take the hint. He sighed, and Poll knew what was different about him. He had been such a jolly man, and now he looked like a sad one. She was glad when Mother came in with the tray. "When you know what I've come to say, Mrs. Greengrass, you may not want to offer me anything. Trouble is, I hardly know how to begin." "Perhaps it will save time, Mr. Rowland, if I say at once that I know what you've come to tell me, and that I am glad about it, even if it's too late to be of much use, of course." He shook his head, and his drooping jowls quivered. "James knew the truth all along, didn't he? I should have known. Mrs. Greengrass, why didn't he tell me my son was a thief? And worse, that he let your good man take the blame." He was blowing and puffing as if he'd been running in a race. Mother said, "Oh, you poor man. He wanted to spare you. What else?" Old Rowland took her hands and bowed his head over them. Mother looked at Poll over his bent head. "You go and find Theo." Theo wasn't in their garden. Poll ran to the end, slipping on the iced-up puddles in the dirt path, looked through the hedge, and saw him by Aunt Sarah's summer-house, crouched on his haunches and scrabbling beneath it. She banged open the wooden gate between the 2 gardens and shouted, "What are you doing?" Theo sat back on his heels. He whispered, "Getting rid of the evidence." "What do you mean?" Aunt Sarah's summer-house, a little room built for her to be private in, with a desk and a bed and a fireplace in one corner, was raised from the ground on brick blocks. Theo pushed earth underneath and banged it flat with his hand. He said, "That gold leaf, just in case that's what he's come for. I had to bury it there because the ground's frozen up everywhere else. I didn't know what to do at first. I mean, he might have wanted to search the house, mightn't he, to look for the gold Dad's taken. Then I remembered the swineherd." Theo stood up, brushing dirt from his knees. "You know, I expect that's what really happened in that old story. It wasn't fairy gold that was found, but real gold that was stolen by someone and hidden. Perhaps the swineherd stole it himself and then wondered how he could possibly explain it to his neighbours why he'd got rich so quickly. Clever when you think of it, really." It was clear in Poll's head that Father had been brave and kind and too fond of old Rowland to want him to know that his only son was a thief. But when she wanted to put this into words, she began to feel muddled. She was sure there was something more to what had happened than that. It was rather as if there were a missing piece of puzzle locked away in a drawer at the back of her mind, and she had somehow mislaid the key to it. "It was nothing to do with your old tin of gold anyway," she said scornfully. "Is Dad coming back? That's all I want to know, really." He said quickly, "Of course he will. If you're thinking about what that horrible woman said, what does she know about it, that horrible bug?" This made her giggle as if he had known that it would. "She walks like a caterpillar. Did you see that? Like this. Look." She went round the side of the summer-house, wriggling her shoulders and bottom and snaking her head about, looking so strange that Aunt Harriet, coming up the path with an armful of coats and scarves, stopped and stared. "What are you doing, child?" "I'm being a caterpillar," Poll said with her sweetest smile. "A beastly caterpillar bug." Aunt Harriet beamed at what seemed to her childish nonsense. "Are you, dear? Well, stop it now and get your things on. We've been looking for you, and the others have given up and gone on ahead with Aunt Sarah. Everyone says the ice is thick enough now at Eel's Pit." It was the first time that winter Now half the town was out on Eel's Pit, sliding or skating, dogs barking wildly, toddlers squealing as they clung to their mothers or bumped down on their well-padded bottoms. Poll and Theo saw George staggering round like a lunatic clown on some old skates of father's, and Lily, on new skates Aunt Sarah had bought her, was pushing a chair uncertainly over the ice. "Come on, Theo!" Poll cried. She dashed at the ice, and it slid squeakily away under her, throwing her flat on her back, legs in the air. Theo pulled her up, laughing. "You've got to start slowly. Try a proper slide. Watch the others." There were 2 slides for the bigger children who didn't have skates, a short one by the fence, and a longer one that went the full length of the pond under the trees. Theo made for this one, and Poll followed him. He said, "It's only for boys, can't you see? That's the girls' slide over there by the fence." Poll saw at once that the boys' slide was not only longer, but better, made faster by strong hobnailed boots. She pulled her mouth down and went towards it, but stopped when she got there. The boys were all bigger than she was, and very much bigger than Theo. They let him join in, though. He took his turn and shot down the slide, a fearful joy in his eyes. He tottered a bit at the end, but kept on his feet. "Oh, it's fast," he said, as he passed Poll to take his place in the line. Poll watched him angrily. Why shouldn't she join in too? There was no law, was there, saying, "No girls on this slide"? She pushed her way in before Theo and took off with a running start, cold air solid in her mouth, icy, glassy smooth under her feet, slipping backwards. It was a marvellous moment halfway when she knew she was going to make it, and from then on it was almost like flying, a lovely, free feeling. She ran back to the start and went down twice more, straight and quick as an arrow. No one tried to stop her, and though some boys laughed, she was too happy to care. Then the 4th time, as she came to the end, someone said, "She's better than the little runt anyway." Noah Bug was standing there, grinning and looking at Theo, who had just fallen at the end of the slide. Noah sang out, green grass, why don't you grow?" with a sly smirk on his face. He sang it again, louder, and as Theo got up and came towards Poll, several boys took up the chant, "Green grass, why don't you grow?" Poll said, "I wouldn't stand for that." Theo turned away, shrugging his shoulders, but she had seen his mouth start to tremble. She shouted at Noah, "You skinny bully, you caterpillar!" and charged him head down. She hit him in the stomach. He grunted and fell, and she fell on top of him. He tried to get up, but she grabbed his hair with both hands and thumped his head up and down. He put his hand under her chin, pushing her off him, rolled her over and held her flat on the ice. Slush trickled down her neck. She could feel it soaking through her clothes. She couldn't move, but Noah's laughing face was above her, so she spat into it as hard as she could and said, "Damn you, you rotten bug! Damn and blast you to hell!" Someone said, "Noah?" and a grin went from his face, as if a curtain had fallen and covered it. He got up awkwardly and shuffled to the side of the pond, red hands dangling. Aunt Sarah said, "Get up, Poll. It's time you went home, I think." Aunt Sarah said nothing else all the way home. Theo didn't speak either until they were in the house, and Aunt Sarah had gone through to the kitchen. Then he caught Poll by the arm, turned her to face him, and whispered softly and savagely, "If you don't mind, I'll fight my own battles in future." Theo marched upstairs and his bedroom door slammed. Poll would have liked to run and hide and cry privately, but she was too wet and shivery. She gulped down the tears in her throat, lifted her chin, and went to the kitchen where Mother had a good fire and water heating up ready. She gave Poll a look and said to Aunt Sarah, "I thought someone might need a bath." Poll said, "Mother, you know that gold Dad brought home for us to make Christmas cards with? Is it valuable?" There was a little pause. Then Mother said with a laugh, "Of course, Poll, all gold is valuable. Even tiny bits. You know how small a gold sovereign is." Poll was pleased with this answer because it proved Theo was right. She would tell him so as a sort of peace offering, and they could be friends again without her having to say she was sorry. Mother was saying, "When all's said and done, you can't help but be sorry. Poor old Roland, he set so much store by that boy of his. A mistake to have only one child, all your eggs in one basket, and he admits that he'd spoiled him. Apparently there had been trouble before, though not on this scale. Just petty pilfering when he was no more than a bit of a lad, nothing serious." If Mr. Roland thought that, then he made a rod for his own back, and I've no sympathy for him, Aunt Sarah said. Stealing is always wrong, even if it is only a sweet or a hairpin, and no child is too young to understand that. A lesson learned young is a lesson for life. I hope you agree with me, Emily. "Yes, Sarah, of course," Aunt Sarah said. "I'm glad Mr. Roland came anyway. It showed respect for James. That wasn't his only reason for coming. He asked me if I was in need of money. Of course I said no." "Yes, of course. There's no reason why he should help. Except that it's hard on you having to pay for my pride." "Nonsense, Emily dear." And she kissed Mother's cheek. When Aunt Sarah had gone, Mother looked at Poll grimly. "What made you get in a fight?" "They laughed at Theo." Poll flushed with anger. "That Noah bug, he called him a runt." Mother sighed. "Will Theo ever grow, do you think? It makes him so miserable." Mother said, "If that's the only cross he ever has to bear in his life, he'll be lucky." And although she often made forbidding remarks of this kind, meaning nothing much by them, Poll felt scared suddenly. Perhaps it was just the growing dark in the kitchen, but it seemed to Poll, as her mother got up to light the oil lamp, that the world was full of unknown dangers, shapeless but menacing, like the shadows in the corners of the room. A week passed, and something much worse did happen to Theo than being teased by Noah Bug. Aunt Sarah knitted him a pink woolen vest, and he had to wear it to school. "I'd rather get a chill than wear that," Theo said. "It's a girl vest. I'd rather die." He meant it. He felt really desperate. Mocking laughter filled his dreams. Tormenting boys danced round him, gimlet-eyed. "We can see what you're wearing, baby Theo Greengrass." He prayed for a miracle, for the house to burn down and the hateful vest with it while they were all safely out. But his prayers were not answered. The first day of school, the humiliating garment was laid out in the chair at the end of his bed. He put it on and came down to breakfast, wishing the earth would open and swallow him. Poll tried to comfort him. "No one will see the vest under your clothes. No one will know." "I'll know." He pushed the porridge round his plate, the tears springing. Mother looked at him helplessly. She said, "Sarah's so good to us, Theo. I can't tell her you wouldn't wear it." All right. I'm wearing a beastly thing, aren't I?" Tears fell into his uneaten porridge, and Poll began to cry too in sympathy. Mother said, "Oh, you too." She got up from the table, went to the scullery, and began to throw dirty pots into the sink, making more noise than seemed necessary. George, off to school early, hitched his satchel up on his shoulder and said, "For heaven's sake, Theo, can't you see you're upsetting her? Don't be so childish." "I am a child," Theo said, sullenly hiccuping. But George had already gone. He went out of the front door, calling back, "Mother, milkman's here." She came from the scullery, drying her hands and muttering under her breath. She forgot to pick up the blue and white jug from the table, and when she reached the door, she called Poll to bring it. The milkman was saying, "So the old sow farrowed early. Do you want a peppermint pig, Miss Greengrass?" Poll looked at him, thinking of sweets, but there was a real pig poking its snout out of the milkman's coat pocket. It was the tiniest pig she had ever seen. She touched its hard little head and said, "What's a peppermint pig?" "Not worth much," Mother said. "Only a token, like a peppercorn rent, almost nothing." "Runt of the litter," the milkman added. "Too small for the sow to raise. He'd only get trampled on in the rush." Mother took the pig from him and held it firmly while it kicked and squealed piercingly. She tipped it to look at its stomach and said, "Well, he seems strong enough, and even runts grow." The milkman took the jug from Poll and went to his cart to ladle milk out of his churn. "Oh," Poll said, "oh, Mother!" She stroked the small, wriggling body. Stroked one way, its skin felt silky to touch. The other way, stiff little hairs prickled her fingers. He was a pale apricot colour all over. The milkman came back. Mother said, "Will you take a shilling?" And he nodded and grinned. Poll took the milk to the kitchen and flew upstairs for her mother's purse. "Theo!" she shouted. "Look what we've got!" An old pint beer mug stood on the dresser. Mother laughed suddenly and popped the pig in it. He made such a fearsome noise that they put their hands over their ears. Poll picked him out and said, "Whatever made you do that?" "I just thought he would fit." And he did. Poll put him down and he scampered desperately round the kitchen, dainty feet skittering on slippery lino. He shot into the scullery and went to ground in the little hole under the copper. Mother said, "Leave him now, poor fellow, he's scared to death. He'll settle down while you're at school." Poll groaned tragically. "Must we go? Oh, I can't bear it. I can't bear to leave him." "He'll be here when you come home dinner time," Mother said. Poll counted the hours. Not just that day, but the next and the next. The thought of the baby pig waiting at home distracted her attention so she had no time left to be naughty. She made a best friend called Annie Dowsett, who was older than she was, and who told her how babies were born. "Butcher comes and cuts you up the stomach with his carving knife," Annie said, "but don't tell your mother I told you." Polly didn't really believe this, because if it were true, women would never have more than one baby, but it was an interesting idea all the same, and she began to feel she quite liked this new school. She even liked her teacher, Miss Armstrong, who had a long, mild sheep's face, and was proud that her aunt was head mistress with her name on a brass plate on the outside of the building. Everyone was a little scared of Aunt Sarah, but not of Aunt Harriet, who was called Miss Harry to her face, and Old Harry behind her back, who romped in the playground with the little ones until her wispy hair came down under her hat, and always brought potatoes to school to bake in the stove for the children who lived too far away to go home for their dinner. Even Theo was happier because of the pig. The excitement of its arrival carried him through the first day, and although after that the horrible shame of the pink girlish vest hidden under his clothes still haunted him, sleeping and waking, especially when he caught Noah Bugg's rolling gooseberry eye in the classroom, he managed to live with it. No one, he told himself, was likely to fall upon him and tear his clothes off, and even if he was sometimes tormented because of his size, he was used to that, and it was a comfort to run home and pick up the pig and whisper in his floppy ear, "Peppermint Pig, Peppermint Pig. I'm a peppermint boy, so there's two of us runts in this family." Mother called the pig Johnnie, saying, rather oddly the children thought, that he reminded her of her grandfather, and it wasn't long before he answered to his name, grunting and running whenever they called him. At night he slept in the copper hole on a straw bed. During the day he trotted busily round behind Mother, or sat on the hearthrug staring thoughtfully into the fire. Lily said, "You can't keep a pig indoors, Mother." "Oh, we had all sorts of animals in the house when I was young," Mother said. "Jackdaws, hedgehogs, newly hatched chicks. I remember times you couldn't get near our fire." "But not pigs," Lily said. "I can't see why not. You'd keep a dog, and a pig has more brains than a dog, let me tell you. If you mean pigs are dirty, that's just a matter of giving pigs a bad name, to my mind. Why, our Johnnie was house-trained in a matter of days, and with a good deal less trouble than you gave me, my girl." Poll giggled, and Lily went pink. Mother said, "Give a pig a chance to keep clean, and he'll take it, which is more than you can say of some humans. You tell me now, does Johnnie smell?" If he did, it was only a mixture of bran and sweet milk, which was all he ate to begin with, although as he grew older, Mother boiled up small potatoes and added scraps from the table. She said there was no waste in a house with a pig, and when the summer came, they would go round the hedgerows and collect dandelions and sow thistle, so he would have plenty of fresh food and grow strong and healthy. "What he eats is important," she said. "Pigs are a poor person's investment." "What's investment?" Poll asked. "Oh, nothing," Mother said quickly. "Never you mind." Poll said, "We aren't poor." "There are degrees," Mother said, speaking absently, and with the creased, worried look on her face that was often there now, and that the children had come to recognize as a sign to keep quiet and not ask for anything. Even letters from Father did not seem to cheer her up as they should have done. Uncle Edmund had left the fruit farm in California to run a saloon in Colorado, and Father had gone with him. The saloon belonged to a woman called Bertha Adams, and for some mysterious reason Uncle Edmund was calling himself Adams too. "I don't like it," Mother said to Aunt Sarah. "It smells fishy to me." She put Father's letter behind the clock on the mantelpiece, looked at her reflection in the mirror above it, and ran her hands through her short, crisp curls. "Well," she said, "well, if James isn't going to make our fortune just yet, I had better do something about it." She went to Mullins's shop in the market square, dressed in her best coat with the jet trimming and her best hat. When she came back, she looked smaller than usual and tired. Poll and Lily watched her as she unpinned her hat and took it off with a sigh. Lily said, "Are you going to work at Mullins's, Mother?" She shook her head and sat down by the fire. Johnnie came and leaned against her, and she pulled his ears gently. She said, "There's my good pig." Lily said indignantly, "Why not? He said he'd give you a job, didn't he?" "He offered me one. He wanted me to take charge of the workroom, set me over Marigold Bug. I didn't like that idea for a start, bound to make trouble, but that wasn't all in his mind. When we went into it, I saw what he meant to do. He didn't say so outright, but I know the old devil. He doesn't like Marigold. She hasn't the grit to stand up to him, and though she's a good worker, best cutter he's got, it makes him look down on her. Once he'd got me in to do the cutting and fitting, he'd get rid of her, and what would she do then, the poor creature? That great boy to care for, and her old father who'd be in the workhouse if she couldn't keep him, and not a soul in the world cares for her." Poll said, "But you don't like Mrs. Bug, Mother. You couldn't possibly like her." "Since she counts me her friend, that makes it worse, doesn't it? I'd be letting her down twice over if I took her place." Lily said, "Poor Mother," and went over to hug her. Poll wished she had thought of doing that, and sat feeling left out while Mother held Lily's hand against her cheek and smiled up to her. "Remember, Lily, that's the worst thing about poverty. Not hunger or leaky boots, but the way it drains out your spirit. However things turn out, you must never let that happen to you. Promise me." Poll sat bewildered. "I would hate to be hungry." And her mother gasped and jumped up from her chair and put her arms round her, holding her so close and tight that Poll could feel her heart fluttering. "Oh, my lamb, of course you're never going to be. Did I frighten you? That was stupid, and there's nothing to be frightened of. Everything is going to be quite all right. You must believe me." She had a notice printed to send to old clients and stuck one in the window. Emily Greengrass begs respectfully to inform the ladies of this district that she has commenced dress and mantle making, and hopes, by strict personal attention, to merit a share of their patronage and support. A good fit and latest style guaranteed. Saturday was market day. "Poll and Theo, you can go shopping," said Mother. "There's not much we need, just 2 loaves of bread and perhaps half a pound of butter from the market stall near the church. It's always nice and fresh there." "We're out of eggs," Theo said. "Are we? Well, eggs are dear just now, but you can have a penny for sweets." Theo frowned. Poll said, "Can we take Johnnie? He loves market day." The pig grunted, hearing his name, and trotted along at their heels, as he always did behind Mother when she went shopping. In the baker's he sat patiently while Poll bought the bread, and the baker came round the counter and patted him and said what a good pig he was, just like a dog. "He's better than any old dog," Poll said scornfully. "Pigs are more intelligent than dogs, that's a scientific fact." And the baker laughed and gave her a sticky bun, free. She offered to share it with Theo, but he shook his head. He hadn't spoken since they left home. Poll said, "Is your throat sore, or has the cat got your tongue?" She bought Cupid's Whispers with the penny, little flat sugary sweets with rhymes written on them. Then they went to the dairy stall near the church. Poll asked for the butter while Theo stood gazing at the things set out on display. Blocks of lovely yellow butter, oozing drops of water, round cheeses cut to show their creamy insides, pieces of bacon for boiling, a basket of big, brown, speckled eggs. There was a faraway expression in Theo's eyes, as if he were lost in some dream. He put out his hand and took one of the brown eggs and put it in his pocket. He looked at Poll and saw she was looking at him, eyes round and startled. Theo grinned foolishly, and her hand flew to her mouth to stop herself giggling. Theo felt his face growing hot. The woman who kept the stall smiled at the 2 pretty, fair children and said, "Have you got all you want now?" "Oh," Poll said, "oh, yes, thank you." Then, in a loud, bustling voice, like a scolding old woman, "Where's Johnnie got to? Oh, there you are, you troublesome pig. Come on, Theo, stir your lazy stumps. We haven't got all day, you know." She set off at a great pace down the cobbled path that led to the church, through the gate into the churchyard, not stopping until she reached the flat tombstone everyone in the town called the soldier's grave, although the inscription was too worn to show who was buried there. Poll sank down on the stone, puffing her cheeks out and fanning herself with her hand as Theo and Johnnie came up to her. "Well," she said, still acting her old woman part, "well, I never did, really." "I feel quite faint," Theo said. "At least, I feel very peculiar." "Then you'd better sit down. Be careful you don't sit on the egg, though." Theo sat down. He took the egg out of his pocket and stared at it as if it was the first egg he had seen in his life. "I really don't know why I did that," he said. And he sounded and looked so amazed that Poll started to laugh. He watched her for a minute, and then began to laugh too. They swayed helplessly, clutching their stomachs, and Johnnie sat looking up at them, intelligent slitty eyes twinkling. Several people, passing through the churchyard, saw the 2 Greengrass children sitting side by side on their soldier's grave and laughing fit to burst, with their pet pig watching them head on one side, as if wondering what they were laughing at. Some smiled as if they wondered too, but only one person stopped. He had followed them from the square and was standing a little way off, hands in his pockets and a thoughtful look on his face. When Poll and Theo grew quieter, he sauntered forward, kicking a stone. It landed in a spurt of dust by Theo's right foot, and Theo looked up. "I doubt if your aunt would find it so funny," Noah Bug said. Poll and Theo sat silent. Noah shook his head sadly. "Thieving," he said. "Stealing from a poor market woman. What's funny in that?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Theo said. Noah laughed. Poll and Theo looked at each other, then at Noah. They saw that his pale green eyes had darker green flecks round the pupils, and that his gingery eyebrows above them were curiously bushy and stiff, as if he were a grown man, not a boy. Theo looked at his boots. "Just one egg." "One or a dozen? What's the difference?" Noah asked, as if he really wanted to know. Theo scuffed his boots in the dust, and Johnnie got up from his haunches as if he thought it was about time they went home. Noah's gooseberry eyes gazed into the distance. "Course, we could ask Miss Greengrass. I reckon that's the sort of question she'd find pretty interesting." Theo sighed. "I mean, she took us in Sunday school last year. Sometimes the Bible and sometimes what she calls morals, about telling lies and stealing and that. Mind you, I don't know she'd like it if I asked her exactly. Not that seeing as it was her own nephew." He looked at Theo, eyes bright and spiteful. "My mother says your precious family thinks such a lot of themselves, a cut above other people." Theo lifted his head. "Tell my aunt then. Go on. Go ahead. Or I'll tell her myself. I don't care." He stood up, smiling calmly at Noah, who took a step back, drawing those strange heavy eyebrows together. "Come on, Paul. Time we were moving. You'll get a chill if we sit here much longer." She shook her head dumbly. She was shivering, but not with the cold. All the things she had ever heard or been told these last months, that she had not paid much attention to or only half understood, had suddenly come together in her mind and made frightening sense. They were dependent on Aunt Sarah until Father came home, or made his fortune in America and sent money back, and so they had to be good. And Aunt Sarah's standards of goodness were unusually high. She had said, "Stealing is always wrong, even a sweet or a hairpin." Paul said, "She'll care. Aunt Sarah will care. She will, Theo." He shook his head, frowning to warn her, make her see it would be all right if they brazened it out, that if Noah believed they weren't worried, he would most likely do nothing. It was only tormenting. He'd be far too scared of Aunt Sarah to go sneaking to her. But Poll was scared now. She burst out, "Oh, please, please, Theo, do stop him." He looked at her, not understanding her terror, but impressed all the same. Poll was frightened. Poll, who was so much braver than he was about almost everything. It made him feel old and protective. Of course, there was one way to settle the matter. If only he were bigger, or not quite such a coward. He hesitated, measuring himself up against Noah, and knew that even if he could screw up his courage to impossible limits, the fight would be over in seconds. Noah was only a few months older than he was, but it might just as well have been years. He was a child beside this strong, well-grown boy. Theo said, resigned, "Look, I'll put the egg back. Will that do? If you like, I'll tell the woman I'm sorry." Noah shrugged his shoulders and grinned. Poll jumped up from the soldier's grave and pleaded with him, "Don't tell Aunt Sarah, please, Noah." "Worth a lot, is it?" "Well, it depends." His green eyes narrowed, sharp as flints, and she shrank against Theo. He said, "Leave her alone, Noah. She's only a girl. No need to bully her." Then to Poll, "I'll see to this. You go on. I'll catch up when I'm ready." There was a note of command in his voice she had not heard before. She picked up the shopping basket, retreated as far as the churchyard gate, Johnnie trotting beside her, and stood looking back. The boys were out of earshot, but she could see that Theo was doing all the talking, waving his hands about energetically, and that Noah was listening with a surprised but interested expression. She took a Cupid's whisper out of her pocket, reading the rhyme before she ate it. Cherry ripe, with lips so red, with curls so bright, you'll soon be wed. Sucking the sweet, she crouched down and put one arm round Johnnie's neck for additional comfort, hugging his warm, solid body and thinking with part of her mind that it was amazing how fast he seemed to be growing. Mother complained that he got under her feet sometimes in the kitchen, and said that when the weather got warmer she would make up a bed for him in the old hen house at the end of the garden. Poll rubbed her chin against the bristly hairs of his neck and sighed. "Oh, poor Johnnie." It seemed that ages passed, but it was only 5 minutes by the church clock when Noah nodded at Theo and walked away, and Theo came slowly towards her. He was pale-faced, but smiling. Poll was relieved by the smile. "He won't tell?" "No, I fixed that. But really, Poll, you are a dimwit. You should never give in to a blackmailer." His smile grew broader and the colour came back into his cheeks. "Lucky he's a pretty stupid one." "What do you mean?" "Nothing. You must have meant something." "Well, perhaps. Let's say nothing you needed to know about anyway. Just that you needn't be scared anymore, because I found a way of stopping his mouth that won't cost me anything, though he thinks that it will." He looked at Poll, eyes shining with secrets and a faint hint of malice. "It's a bit subtle for you, I'm afraid. You might not understand if I told you. It's between me and Noah, so you leave it like that and just trust me." By the time Easter came, Poll felt that she had lived in Norfolk for years and knew every inch of the town. Not like a real map with contours and rivers, but like a private one drawn in her mind. If she closed her eyes, she could see a dancing bear in the market square, Theo and Noah in the churchyard, a robin's nest among the primroses in the bank down Tank Lane, herself skipping with her new rope down the avenue of walnut trees at the back of the church, or turning somersaults on the white wooden railings of the town pit and hanging upside down to watch the shire horses standing to drink, lifting their great dripping mouths. "Why the town pit?" she asked. "It's a pond." "Ponds are always called pits in Norfolk," Aunt Sarah said. "Eel Pit is where we went skating, of course," said Aunt Harriet. "And Bride's Pit is a good place for frog spawn." "Not a place to go after dark," Mother said. "Have I told you that dreadful tale, how the pit got its name? One night, long ago, a bride and groom drove out of the town in a closed coach drawn by 2 fine black horses. It was a wild night, clouds blowing over the moon, and when the coachman came to Bride's Pit, he missed the road and turned down the cart track instead, into the water. He tried to turn back, but too late. The coach was too heavy to turn, and they had all vanished forever. The coachman, the horses, the poor young couple, cut off in their prime. On dark nights, they say, you can hear it happen again. The wheels of the coach on the road, the galloping horses, the terrible screams of the bride. "Annie Dowsett lives on the road past Bride's Pit," Poll said. "I wouldn't like to be her going home winter time." "Don't you spend too much time with that Annie Dowsett," Mother said. "Why not?" "Just because." "Annie's my friend," Poll said, but under her breath and so softly that only Theo heard her. Poll knew quite well why her mother disliked Annie Dowsett, because she liked her for just the same reason. Annie was rough. She wore old clothes all the time. She fought with boys and was ready for anything. She even agreed to accompany Poll into the slummy part of the town called the Shambles, a tightly packed jumble of narrow streets and old houses that Aunt Sarah said no nicely brought-up girl would walk through even in daylight, and certainly not after dark. "I'd be scared," Lily said with a shudder. And so, naturally, Poll wanted to go there. She and Annie went into the Shambles the last day of the Easter term after school. Poll was nervous at first, not knowing what to expect, and then disappointed to find nothing really alarming, only a rather dirty place where vegetable rubbish squelched underfoot and women stood on their doorsteps and gossiped while their babies played around their feet. Poll thought she had never seen so many babies, fat ones and thin ones, pale ones and rosy ones, crawling in the dirt, clinging to their mother's skirts, or sitting, grubby and grumbling, in rickety prams. One baby stopped crying and smiled at her when she picked up his rattle from the ground where he'd thrown it. His fat cheeks were solid and shiny. Poll said to his mother, "Look, he likes me. Can I take him for a walk, do you think?" The woman looked at Poll without answering. She was tall and big in the chest, with a dark, heavy face and hard, glistening eyes like dark glass. When she started to laugh, throwing her head back, Poll saw that she had a lot of teeth missing, and that one of those that were left was long and sharp like a spike or a fang. She stared, fascinated, and then realized that the woman was laughing at her. As she backed away, the woman on the next doorstep began laughing too, and the next woman, and the next, until the cruel, raucous noise seemed to fill the whole street and press on her eardrums like thunder. Annie grabbed at her hand. "Come on," she said urgently. "Run!" They ran, mud splashing their legs, and worse things than mud, Poll thought, wrinkling her nose, through mean, twisting alleys, past dark, open-doored hovels and staring, slatternly women, to the safety of the wide market square. They filled their lungs with clean air and looked at each other, Poll sheepishly, Annie astonished. "Whatever do you want to speak to her for? Bit daft, wasn't it?" "I don't know." Poll felt sick with shame. That horrible jeering laughter still rang in her head. Annie shrugged. "If you want babies, you can come to my house and welcome any time you've a mind to." "Thank you," Poll said. "I'd like to sometime. I'll ask my mother." She hoped it didn't show in her face that she knew Mother would never give her permission. In fact, she went without it, only 2 days later, and in a howling temper. That was the Thursday before Easter. After midday dinner, Mother made her first batch of hot cross buns, working the yeasty dough with floury hands, marking the little brown cakes with the back of a knife, and setting them to rise in front of the fire. She went into the scullery to wash the bowl and her hands, turning her back for barely a minute, and when she came back, the buns had all gone. Not a crumb left, only a plumply satisfied pig, sitting on the rag-rug and smiling into the fire. "Drat that animal," she said, and reached for the broom. "Hen house for you!" Poll heard Johnnie squeal and ran to the kitchen. Mother set her lips ominously, jabbed at Johnnie's behind with the broom, and drove him grunting into the garden and down the long cinder path. Poll followed to the hen-house, protesting. "It's not fair to shut him up, Mother." "Fair or not fair, that's where he's going, and that's where he'll stay." "He didn't mean to do anything wrong. The buns were where he could reach them. Perhaps he thought they were meant for him as a treat." "My fault, I suppose. Oh, well, that's one good lesson learned. Ridiculous letting a great pig have the run of the house. A pig is a pig, and he'll be treated like one from now on." "But he's not used to it. He's used to being a person." Johnnie stood inside the hen run, ears flopping forward over his eyes, looking up with what seemed to Poll a dejected expression. "He's hurt," she said. "His feelings are hurt. Oh, it's wicked and cruel. You're cruel, Mother." "That's enough from you, my girl." "I hate you," Poll said. Mother looked at her levelly. "I didn't hear that." And Poll did not dare repeat it, not to her face anyway. Nor did she dare to let Johnnie out, although when her mother had gone back indoors, she examined the gate of the hen-house and was glad to see the catch was so rotten that he only had to give one good push in the right place to set himself free. She scratched his back to console him and whispered, "Poor Johnnie, you're a good pig. She's hateful. I hate her. I hate her so much I'll never forgive her for this as long as I live." She wished she could go right away and never see or speak to her mother ever again. Dad had gone, hadn't he? Now she saw why. He couldn't bear to stay with such a mean, spiteful person. Where could she go? Well, one place for a start. She said in a voice hoarse with tears, "I'm going off to see Annie, that's where I'm going, and I may never come back." And she set off at once on what was to be, by the end of the day, the most frightening journey she had ever made in her life. Burning eyes fixed on the road, she ran as if there were devils behind her until she was well clear of the town, out of breath, and feeling better for it. Poll stayed in the middle of the road because the deep ruts at the side wore your boots out, but keeping a sharp eye on the hedgerows. There were birds' nests to watch for, and perhaps she might see a weasel with her babies running behind her, nose to tail, for all the world, so Aunt Harriet said, like a string of circus elephants, only smaller, of course. No such luck today. Just a cock pheasant whirring up from the other side of the hedge with a clatter of wings and a spine-chilling yell, just before she came to Bride's Pit. Lucky to get away, that old pheasant, she thought, because there was a gypsy camp at the pit. 2 painted caravans parked on the green cart track where the bride's coach had plunged down into the water, washing spread out on the bushes and cooking pots steaming. Barking dogs hurled themselves the length of their chains as Poll passed, but the gypsies only stared at her, bold-eyed and unsmiling. She didn't have the courage to linger, although she'd have liked to. It seemed such an enviable life. Meals out of doors and no school, and it would have been exciting to get more than a glimpse of the inside of one of those caravans. What she could see, gleaming brass and bright curtains, looked invitingly cosy and comfortable. By contrast, Annie's house seemed a poor, gloomy place. A tiny, thatched cottage, some centuries old, crouching in the shadow of a densely overgrown wood. As Poll left the sunny road and walked up the short, muddy track, the air seemed to grow perceptibly damper and chillier, and if Annie had not been there at the open front door, she might have lost her nerve and turned back. Annie said, "I didn't think you'd come," and ran indoors, leaving Poll standing there feeling awkward until Annie's mother appeared, one baby straddling her hip, another peeping out from behind her. She looked more like Annie's grandmother than her mother, Poll thought, with her scraped back hair and sad eyes set deep in hollows, but her thin face was friendly when she smiled and invited Poll in. There was only one room downstairs, and although the stone floor was swept and clean, and there were pots of geraniums on the window-sill, there was very little furniture in it. A table, a few stools, a wheel-back chair by the fire, and an old sack instead of a hearth-rug. No books, no pictures, no friendly clutter of ornaments. Surely even very poor people had things in their houses they liked to look at. Thinking this, she was half afraid to look at Annie, but when she did, Annie just grinned at her and said to her mother, "Poll likes babies." She could not have sounded more disbelieving if she had said, "Poll likes saber-toothed tigers." Her mother said, "It's just as well we're not all like you, Annie, or it'd be a poor lookout for human race. Here you are, Polly." She put the baby who was perched on her hip into Poll's arms and shook her head when he started to whimper and fight to get back to her. "I'd be right glad to be free of him for a while, I can tell you. On the grizzle ever since he woke up this morning, poor little tinker. Annie, you take our Archie too and stay out till tea time." Archie was 3 years old, pink-cheeked and bright-eyed and solid as a little rock. Poll's baby, Tom, was about a year younger and very much quieter. After a minute or two he seemed content to be carried by this strange girl, and settled with his head on her shoulder and his thumb in his mouth. "Like to see our pig?" Annie said. Poll said she would, but regretted it. The Dowsett pig stood knee-deep in filth in a ramshackle sty surrounded by nettles. Some pigs have mean, narrow faces, but his was friendly and blunt, and his flat, damp nose turned up at the tip, giving him an engaging air of comic surprise. Poll scratched his back pityingly and thought of Johnnie, scrubbed every few days with a garden broom, and kept, Mother said, pink and sweet as a clean baby's bottom. She asked, "What's his name?" "Just Pig," Annie said. "What's the point giving a name to a pig what's going to be killed come the autumn?" She gave a wild snort of laughter. "Oh, last pig, didn't I foller?" Poll felt dizzy with shock. She said faintly, "Our pig's called Johnnie." Annie looked at her sidelong. "Oh, well," she said after a minute, "your pig's special pig-like. That's a bit different." They took the babies through a meadow to a shallow brook that chuckled between sandy banks. Archie splashed at the edge of the water, shouting with laughter. Poll put little Tom down on the grass and tickled his stomach to make him laugh too. But although he smiled once or twice, he soon started to whine and chew at his knuckles, and seemed happier when she sat quiet and he could nestle against her. He felt hot, and Poll dipped her handkerchief in the cool water and bathed his head with it. Annie called him "miserable little bugger," but Poll enjoyed comforting him, and while Archie and Annie ran races and threw stones in the river, she rocked Tom and sang to him until Annie said it was time to go back. Poll had not meant to stay for tea. The Dowsetts were too poor to want to feed visitors, but the table was laid, and Annie's mother had set a place for her. They had boiled bacon pudding and bread spread with dripping flavoured with rosemary that tasted so good Poll ate 4 thick slices. When she had finished, Tom climbed onto her lap and went to sleep there. Mrs. Dowsett said, "You've got a good way with babies, I can see that with half an eye." Poll beamed proudly. She would have liked to stay in the warm, smoky cottage, cuddling Tom while he slept, but dusk was falling outside, bats flitting against the dark wood. She said reluctantly, "I ought to go home." "Annie'll show you a piece of the way," Mrs. Dowsett said. "There's a short cut, no need to traipse all the way back by the road." They went round the back of the cottage, skirting the wood, to a ride through the trees. Annie said, "Turn right at the end, you can't miss." It looked very gloomy and secret. No birdsong, no rustles, only the squeak of their boots on damp grass. Poll said, "Is it far?" Annie shook her head. She seemed unwilling to stay any longer, and Poll was ashamed to admit she would rather go home by the road. She said goodbye as cheerfully as she could manage and set off down the green, grassy way. Purple shadows around her. Above, a thin strip of navy-blue sky with no stars. Poll hummed softly to keep her courage up. She wasn't afraid. There was nothing to be afraid of in a wood, and she couldn't get lost as long as she kept to the ride. But which ride? She came to a fork. Was it here she had to turn right? She decided to keep on what seemed the main path, but quite soon it started to narrow and the branches closed over her head. Should she go back? Was this the way through the wood, or only a poacher's trail? Poll thought of poachers, and her heart thudded. She thought, man-traps. There was an old man-trap hanging outside Nero's junk shop in Station Street, a hideous contraption with cruel teeth and a notice above it that said, "Nero's Little Nipper." Aunt Harriet said it was just an old curiosity, and that man-traps were illegal now, But how could she be sure that there was not one left in this wood, abandoned and rusty, but savagely dangerous still? Poll walked on delicately, straining to see where she had put her feet down, and when the path widened again, held her breath and ran down the centre of it until the trees began to thin out and she came to a road. Poll breathed easier out of the wood, but the road was not one she knew. She turned right, came to a fork, hesitated, and turned right again. Although the moon had risen now and was bobbing along beside her on the other side of the hedgerow, a wind had got up, and ragged clouds blew across it. Poll trudged on with aching legs and sinking heart, as the night became wilder and blacker. When she saw a tiny light some way off the road, she laughed aloud with relief and broke into a run. The light flickered in the upstairs window of a cottage at the end of a farm track. The garden gate creaked as Poll opened it, startling her. She expected a dog to bark, but there was no sound except the wind in the tall trees overhead as she pushed her way through a tangle of brambly bushes to the cottage door. She knocked timidly, waited, and then knocked again harder. No one answered. She stepped back and called up to the window. "Please, is anyone there?" A long time seemed to pass. The silence unnerved her. Then curtains were drawn back with a rattle of wooden rings, and a head appeared, silhouetted against the pale yellow light. An old man with white hair. "Please," Poll said, "please, I'm sorry, I'm lost." The old man peered down at her. "Where do you want to get to?" he asked, and when she told him, gave a high, thin, rattling laugh that turned into a cough, breath wheezing in and out as if his chest was a dusty bellows. He spoke in broad Norfolk, but Poll understood him, and he was clearly pointing in the direction she was already going. She thanked him politely, feeling a good deal less weary now she knew she was on the right way, and when she got back to the road, hopped and skipped along eagerly, beginning to enjoy what suddenly seemed an adventure, out on her own this wild night. Theo would have been afraid, but she wasn't. How she would boast when she got home. She had not really been lost. She knew where she was now. Just ahead was a familiar bend, and beyond the bend lay Bride's Pit. She slowed down a little and tried to walk quietly. Once she was past, safe past the bend and the pit, she would run the last mile. Then she heard it. Heard galloping horses, and above the drumming sound of their hoofs, the wheels of the coach. Terror seemed to drive the breath from her body, but she walked on mechanically, hypnotized by what she knew she would see when she turned the next corner. And see it she did. First, Bride's Pit. The gypsies had gone, and it looked very desolate, the water velvety black against the grey grass. Then the phantom coach with 2 galloping horses coming towards her, a coachman on the box, and carriage lamps lighting the hedgerows. Poll stopped and shrank into a gateway, waiting for what was going to happen, for the horses to turn off the road down the cart track, and for the terrible screams that must follow as they plunged into the pit. She opened her mouth to scream herself, but no sound came out. The coach was so close now she could see sparks flying from the hooves of the horses and the pale gleam of the coachman's face under his hat. Her legs gave way beneath her and she sank to her knees, covering her eyes with her hands. The ground shook. The iron sound of wheels deafened her. She froze to the ground like a hare as the coach passed Bride's Pit. Not a ghostly conveyance, but the mail coach that left the market square every night as the church clock struck 9. She looked up as it passed her, watched it sway round the bend, listened as the sound of wheels and hooves died away. It was some time before she moved. She had never felt so cold in her life, nor so vulnerable, as if nothing would ever be safe and solid again. Although she had not in fact seen a ghost, she had met fear of a kind she had not known before, and that frightened her. Her own fear frightened her. As she walked slowly homeward, she tried to give this fear shapes. There was a donkey that haunted Tank Lane, and a black dog local people had seen that was sometimes bad, sometimes good. But the thought of these friendly ghosts did not frighten her now, nor ever would ever again, she realized suddenly. The fear that walked with her was a dark dream in her mind and had no shape at all. When she heard running footsteps approaching, they did not frighten her. She marched steadily on, head held high. Theo had been running so fast he was wheezing. He gasped, "I thought you might come this way. Mother was in such a state. Then I remembered Annie, and I guessed you'd gone there." He giggled and wheezed like the old man at the cottage, teaching Mother a lesson. Poll nodded. "I was at Bride's Pit when the mail came. I thought it was the bride's coach." "Oh, Poll, were you scared?" "Just a bit. Not for long, though." He gave an excited groan. "I'd have died." "No, you wouldn't. It wasn't like that." But she wouldn't explain what it was like. Couldn't find the right words. She was too tired suddenly, longing for home, for the comfort of her mother's warm lap. Perhaps as a special treat, Mother might give her a cup of hot elderflower wine, fingers of toast. The front door stood open. She ran down the passage and threw open the door of the kitchen. Mother and Aunt Harriet were standing there waiting. There was no comfort in their expressions, no loving welcome. Their faces loomed over her. Their voices rose. "You naughty girl!" Theo came to no harm from that chilly spring night, but Poll caught scarlet fever from little Tom Dowsett and nearly died of it. She was so hot in church on Easter Sunday. Her cream alpaca dress weighed her down, her starched knickers cut into her, and the elastic that held on her new floppy hat was a steel band under her chin. When they stood up for the hymn, her legs bent like a rag doll's legs. The next thing she knew, she was sitting outside the church on the soldier's grave, her mother's hand on the back of her neck, and cold stone beneath her. Then she was at home, in her bed, and the doctor leaned over her. He had a black curly beard, and his breath smelled of onions. She turned her head away while he examined her chest and her stomach. But when he made her open her mouth so he could inspect her throat, she got the full blast of his oniony breath. It made her sick, and Mother cleaned her up and sprinkled her pillow with lavender water. The doctor stood by the window, huge body blocking the light, and Poll heard him say, "Hospital's the best place. I'll send the fever cart for her." Poll screamed and screamed, although the pain seemed to slice her throat open, until the doctor put his hands over his ears, and her mother gathered her up in her arms, stroked her damp hair back, and said, "Hush, my lamb. Do you think I'd send you to any old hospital?" She hung a sheet soaked in carbolic over Poll's door and put the tin bath just outside so she could wash and change all her clothes whenever she left Poll to look after the others. For the first nightmarish days and nights, that wasn't often. Whenever Poll woke, she was there to change her nightdress and bathe her hot head. Poll had to stay in her room for 6 weeks until the infection had left her. The world shrank to 4 walls and a window, and what went on outside was a story she had no part in and could only listen to. Some of the things she heard were happy, some of them sad. She heard the passing bell begin to toll. It would ring 7 times for a man, 6 for a woman, 3 for a child. Poll lay in her bed, dreamily listening. 1. A horse cluttered by in the square. 2. 3. And the deep sound trembled on the air as if the bell was sorry to stop so soon. 4, 5, 6, the voice of death sang. But these last peals were only echoes. Mother came into her room and told her the Dowsett baby was dead. Not little Tom, but his bouncing 3-year-old brother. Poll felt very strange, sad and excited at the same time. Poor Annie. She must feel so important, going to school and telling everyone her brother was dead. Archie, lying in his coffin, waxen face covered with flowers. Poll thought, I might have died too, and started to cry. Mother said, I must go to that poor woman. Shall I take your love to Annie? Do you think she'd like me to make her a dress? Most of the day now, Mother's treadle sewing machine whirred in the front room downstairs. She had plenty of customers, but she found time to make a dress for Annie, a best dress with lace collar and cuffs and a tucked bodice. Poll said, she'll want new boots too. No use having a new dress and old boots. I'll see what I can manage, Mother said. There's a pair of lilies grown out of she's hardly worn. They'd do for the summer. Is it summer already? Poll said. The year had turned while she was ill. With the first of the really warm weather, she sat, propped up on pillows, cutting pictures out of magazines for her scrapbook. She stuck Father's postcards in too. He had left Uncle Edmund and a saloon in Colorado, and found a job as valet to a rich Englishman who was travelling round America. Since he heard Poll was ill, he had sent her a card almost every day, covered in such tiny writing it hurt her eyes to read it. The cards came from the Grand Canyon, from Niagara Falls, from San Francisco. Aunt Sarah said they would be useful for geography, and bought Poll an atlas. But the card Poll liked best was made of soft leather with a picture of a bear on it and the message, I can hardly bear to leave you. In the afternoon, when Theo and Lily and George came home from school, they took it in turns to sit on the other side of the carbolic sheet and read to her. She said to Theo, Do you know, I've quite forgotten what you look like. He was quiet for a minute and said, You'll get a surprise when you see me. I'm growing like our Peppermint Pig. Not a peppermint boy any longer. Oh, I do wish I could see Johnnie, Poll said. She heard him that afternoon. He made such a noise in the back garden, squealing and trumpeting, that the sound carried through to Poll's little room in the front of the house. She sat up in bed, rigid and trembling. Something awful was happening, or going to happen. A dreadful thought pierced her mind and invaded her body. Her heart and her stomach seemed to come loose inside her and lurch with foreboding. Annie had said, Our pig didn't half holler. She pushed shaky legs out of bed and tottered, head swimming, past the carbolic curtain, through her mother's room to the back bedroom. Johnnie's wild protest continued, a shrill hooting and honking that sounded more like 10 pigs than one as she struggled with the sash window. Then the noise stopped abruptly. Poll lay across the sill, faint with effort, the summer air cold on her forehead. She moaned, Johnnie, oh, Johnnie. Below, in the garden, her mother was standing at the fence talking to the woman next door. They looked up at Poll in a sudden shocked silence that seemed to her terrified mind a guilty conspiracy. She said, Mother, what are you doing? You've no business up. You know that. Back to bed with you. She seemed to have no breath left. She whispered, Where's Johnnie? Shut up in the hen house. Do as you're told. She crept back to bed and lay shaking all over. afraid, now she knew Johnnie was safe, of her mother's anger. Suppose she told the doctor and he said, "Off to hospital." But when Mother came up, she was smiling. "That dratted pig, do you know what he's done? Pushed his way through the fence and ate next door's gooseberries. Picked them straight off the bushes, dainty as anything, the whole crop. She caught him at it and went after him with a spade, and he led her a fine old dance, catch as catch can, round the garden." Paul was weak with relief. "Oh, Mother, I thought—" Tears choked her voice. Mother muttered something under her breath, sat down on the bed and held her hand while she had her cry out. Then she said, "He won't stay shut up in the hen-house too long, so you needn't fret about that. I'll get George to mend the fence as soon as he's home. He might not do it for me, but he'll do it for Johnnie. You're not the only one soft-hearted about the old pig, you know." "I expect when I get up I'll find he's forgotten me," Paul said mournfully. But he hadn't. The first day she came down, he trotted into the front room where she lay on the old leather sofa, put his soft twitching nose against the palm of her hand for a moment, then grunted twice and laid his heavy head in her lap. She said, "Oh, he's huge! He's quite different." His eyes hadn't changed, though. When she pushed back his ears, they seemed to smile up at her. Dark blue eyes with long, stiff, lint-pale lashes. "Too big for the house, really," Mother said. "Let him stay, please. He's been lonely for me. You can see he won't get in your way while you're sewing." "Just a while, then. Long as no one's due for a fitting. Some of my ladies are a bit fussy." "I should think they'd be glad to see Johnnie," Paul said, and the pig grunted as if in agreement and settled comfortably down by the sofa. The whole town, it seemed, had been worried about her. Shopping with Mother, they were met everywhere with kind, beaming faces, and when they went into Mullen's general store, old Mullen himself came out of his office and said, "Glad to see you out and about, young woman. There was a time your mother thought she might lose you." That made Paul feel very important. When she looked in the mirror, she sucked in her cheeks and practiced a faint, hollow smile that made her look sad and interesting. The day she met Lady March, she had got this smile to perfection. She and Mother were crossing the square on their way to the baker's when a carriage stopped beside them, and a high, cracked old voice said, "Oh, Mrs. Greengrass, I am so delighted to see your dear little girl is quite well again." Lady March's face was like a piece of thin, crumpled paper under the spread sails of her hat, her fluttering, gloved hands frail as birds' wings. Paul looked modestly down, smiling her sad, rehearsed smile, and Lady March said, "Poor pretty child, I'm afraid she still looks very delicate." "Only when she pulls that silly face," Mother said rather grimly. She ignored Paul's reproachful sigh and went on, "I'm glad we've met, Lady March. Perhaps you would be kind enough to tell your daughter her new dress is ready whenever she wishes to call and collect it." This dress, as Paul knew, had been ready for more than 2 weeks, and the most likely reason why Arabella March had not come to fetch it was that she had overspent her quarter's allowance. Only that morning Mother had looked in her purse and said with an angry sniff, "I suppose not paying what they owe is one of the ways rich people save money." Lady March laughed like glass tinkling. "I expect she forgot, my dear. You know what girls are. But I'll remind her, of course. I know she's been really quite pleased with the work you've done for her up to now. As a matter of fact, I might ask you to do something for me. Not a new gown. As you know, I always get my things made at Mullen's. It's so much more convenient to be able to get the material there and put it down on the bill, don't you know? But I have an afternoon gown that needs renovating, and I have never found Mrs. Bug very helpful with alterations. Won't take the trouble, I suppose. It's the same story wherever you turn nowadays. Standards of service are not what they used to be. But then I expect you know that as well as I do." "Oh, yes," Mother said. "Yes, Lady March. "I'll bring you the gown, then." She smiled graciously, as if the gown was a present. "Would this afternoon be convenient?" "I'm afraid not, Lady March. Not this week at all. One of my customers has a funeral on Friday, and that, as you know, really must take priority." The manservant driving the carriage had been sitting still on the box and staring straight ahead all this time. He cleared his throat suddenly, and Mother's mouth twitched. A purplish colour crept into Lady March's cheeks, as if she felt she was being laughed at in some way. Poll felt sorry for her and looked at Mother indignantly, but her expression was innocent. Lady March said, "Well, next week, perhaps. To tell you the truth, Mrs. Greengrass, one reason I am anxious to come is to see your famous pet pig, the one everyone is talking about. I know, Mrs. Greengrass, I have a splendid idea. Would you be kind enough to bring him up to the manor one day, round to the back door, and show me his tricks? Of course, you could pick up the gown at the same time, couldn't you?" Mother gave her a long, hard, pitying look and shook her head slowly. "My Johnnie is not a back door or a kitchen pig, Lady March, nor does he do tricks like a freak in a fair. A formal invitation to visit you would be a different matter, of course." The manservant took a red handkerchief out of his pocket and blew his nose loudly. The noise startled the horse, and the carriage jerked forward over the cobbles. The man looked over his shoulder and grinned. Mother smiled pleasantly. "Good morning, Lady March. You will give my message to your daughter, won't you?" She took Poll's hand and walked on. Out of earshot she chuckled. "Really, the cheek of the woman!" Poll said, puzzled. "She only wanted to see Johnnie." "Just a sprat to catch a mackerel, Poll. Mullins won't do alterations at a price she's willing to pay, that's the truth of it." "Well, I won't either. I may have sunk down in the world, but not so low that I'm ready to turn the seams on an old miser's gown for a shilling and a kind word or two. That's the last we'll hear of that, I do hope." She was wrong. The next day the manservant came to the door with a note on an engraved card. Lady March would be pleased if Mrs. Greengrass, her younger daughter, and her pet pig would care to take tea with her next Friday at 4. Mother sat in the kitchen and laughed. "She's beaten me," she gasped. "Oh, she's a sly one. Run to the door, Poll, and tell the man we'd be delighted to come. No, wait a minute. I'll write, since we're being so grand with each other." Poll watched her write. She said, "Shall you alter her dress after all?" Mother put her note in an envelope and stuck it down. "Oh, yes, she's earned it." Mother scrubbed Johnnie down with the broom. Since he liked having his back scratched, he found this no hardship, and left him to dry in the sun while she and Poll dressed. Poll wore her pink shantung with a hanging pocket to match, and her leghorn hat trimmed with daisies. "Now you're fit to have tea with the Queen," Mother said. They set off at 20 minutes to 4, Johnnie walking sedately behind them across the market square, past the church, and took a shortcut through the ruins of the old priory on the edge of the town. "Poll, love," Mother said, "forget the unkind things I said about Lady March. She's not a bad old thing, really." And Poll thought at first she was just saying this because she felt happy and wanted everything to be pleasant about her. But then she added, "It's hard to be lonely and old and know that even your servants laugh at you when your back's turned." And Poll remembered the man snorting into his handkerchief and grinning on the box of the carriage, and knew it was true. He had the same knowing grin on his face when he opened the door to them, and it made Poll indignant. Copying her mother, she averted her gaze and ignored his impertinence. It was harder to ignore the two young maids giggling at the far end of the hall, particularly when she knew they were not just laughing at the sight of a pig walking in the front entrance and at foolish old Lady March for inviting him, but at her and her mother too for joining in this daft game. But she did her best. Johnnie went straight to it as if he was accustomed to being received like a gentleman. Lady March, looking small and witch-like without her big hat, scratched his ears tentatively, and he sat down by her chair and leaned against her. "Oh," she said. "Oh, my." "Push him away if he's heavy," Mother said. "He won't hurt you, or your carpets. He's as well trained as a good dog in that way." "I've never had a dog in my drawing-room either," Lady March said. One of the maids brought in tea. She was still giggling openly, and when Lady March motioned her to put the tray down on a low table beside her, she dumped it down with a rough air of contempt that Poll recognised as deliberate. Lady March poured tea and offered them bread and butter and cake. The bread and butter had been cut a long time and was curling at the edges, and the jam had a film of dust over it, as if the dish had been left standing uncovered by the side of a fire. But the cake was all right, a rich, dark fruit cake that no one could spoil. Poll ate 3 slices and answered Lady March's questions. Yes, she was very much better. No, she wasn't back at school yet, but she would be next week. Yes, she was looking forward to it. She heard herself saying this with surprise and wondered if she could really mean it. At last tea was over, and when Lady March took Mother upstairs to look at the gown that had to be altered, Poll escaped into the garden with Johnnie. She went round the side of the house into the stable-yard and peeped through the window at the kitchen. The man who doubled as coachman and butler was sitting with his feet on the table. The 2 young maids sat either side of him, and a fat woman in a black dress and apron presided over the teapot. There was a splendid spread on the table. Muffins, a crusty new loaf, cheese, butter, jam, and several sorts of cake. Poll thought of Lady March's tea tray laid out with the stale bread and dusty jam, and felt herself swelling with anger in a way she had not done for ages. The other side of the yard, there was a rose garden, and beyond that, a small wood full of foxgloves. Full of maybugs, too, the air whirred with them. Poll knocked one down with her hat and picked it up as it lay stunned on the ground. Its little horny feet tickled her palm. She put it into her handkerchief pocket and went on knocking down the flying beetles until she had a buzzing, angry pocketful. She went back to the stable-yard and looked in the kitchen window again. They were still sitting there, stuffing themselves. One of the girls said something and they all roared with laughter, wet, greedy mouths open. The man belched loudly and slapped his stomach. The window was open at the bottom. Poll loosed the thread of her handkerchief pocket and emptied the maybugs over the sill with a jerk of her wrist. Fright, or rage at being shut up, made them buzz louder than ever now they were free, and within seconds the girls and the fat cook were screaming, beating frantic hands in the air, running round the room, banging into each other, knocking chairs over. The man jumped up too. He saw Poll at the window, and she put her thumbs in her ears and waggled her fingers and stuck out her tongue at him before she ran off. Johnnie was sitting patiently on the path in front of the house. Poll reached him as her mother and Lady March came out of the door. Mother was saying, "I'll speak to Mrs. Dowsett then and bring Annie to see you." But Lady March was looking at Poll. She said, in a surprised voice, "Why, the child looks quite different. Much better than she did early on, don't you know?" Mother smiled. "You wouldn't think she'd ever been ill to look at her." "Oh, I'm better," Poll said. "I started to be better about 2 minutes ago, and I'm quite better now." Theo said, "If Mother grumbles about someone to start with, you can be sure she'll end up taking their part. I bet you anything Lady March will be someone she has to take care of, like Annie Dowsett." Annie was often in their house now. She was shy with George and Lily and Theo, but she worshipped Mother, following round at her heels, just like the old pig, Lily said, though she was careful not to let Mother hear this. Annie's a good girl, Mother said. She just needs encouragement. When Annie left school at Christmas, she was going into service with Lady March at the manor house. That's a good turn done for them both, Mother said when she arranged this. Poor old soul needs someone who doesn't look down on her. I told her if I were you, I'd get rid of those flibbity-gibbet girls and get someone respectful. And it'll be a fine place for Annie. My mother went to the manor house as a kitchen maid and ended up cook. No reason why Annie shouldn't do just as well. She's got a nice light hand with pastry already. I think Annie's lucky, Poll said enviously. I wish I could leave school. School's boring. I hate it. She was only there mornings because she was still thought to be delicate, and although she was quite glad to be back at first for a change, that wore off quite soon. In the afternoons, while everyone else was locked up in school, she kept out of Mother's way and roamed free as air. She went to Bride's Pit, and if there were no gypsies there, poked the water buttercups away with a stick, and picked up the horrid black leeches that crawled on the sandy bottom near the edge of the water, or explored the woods, kicking puffballs into dust clouds and keeping a sharp lookout for Keeper Green. Sometimes, if it was hot and she was feeling lazy, she just crossed the square and went down Tank Lane and climbed an old elm tree and watched the world go by. Not that many people came down Tank Lane. Tramps sometimes. Mr. Snoop, the postman, with the 2 cows he grazed on the lush roadside verges. The rabbit-skin man, a long stick with rabbits skewered on it over his shoulder. Percy, the washerwoman's son, who helped his mother by fetching and carrying the washing in a wooden box on wheels. Percy was dumb, except for a queer noise he made in his throat, midway between a croup and a crow. Hoop, hoop, as he pushed his old box along, dipping his head up and down like a bird drinking. Another day, she saw Theo and Noah Bug. They were walking along like friends, heads together, and she noticed, surprised, that Theo was almost as tall as Noah now. She heard Noah laugh and say, "You'll have to think of something else then, won't you, if you want to keep on?" Theo said something she couldn't catch, and Noah laughed again. "Give over then, Greengrass. It's all one to me." He walked off, whistling, and Theo stood and stared after him. When Poll called out softly, he looked up and turned red as a poppy. "You spying on me?" he said as he slid down the tree. "What are you blushing about?" "I'm not." "Yes, you are. I can see your face, can't I? You scared me, that's all." She saw his sly, silly smile, his eyes puckering up at the corners. "He's still teasing you, is he?" "Blackmailing's the word." "Because of that egg you stole? But that's stupid." "You didn't think so at the time," he reminded her. "That's not fair. I was only young then. I didn't know any better. Not fair blaming me." He kicked a loose stone on the road. "I'm not really. You were right in a way. You might have told Mrs. Bug, and it would have upset Mother if she'd spread the tale round. Like Mrs. Bug said, blood will out. I mean, there was that trouble when Dad left his firm, and I thought, suppose Mrs. Bug knows and wants to make something of it. It'd give her a fine chance if she knew I'd been caught stealing too. Well, not two, because Dad didn't take any money, but you know what I mean." "No, I don't," Poll burst out. "You're just muddling me up like you always do. Muddling yourself as well, I should think. You unmuddle me, then." He looked so wretched that she felt sorry. Poor Theo. He was older than she was, and cleverer, but sometimes it seemed that being clever just made him unhappy. She said, "Well, it was such a long time ago, wasn't it? Ages and ages. If Noah went sneaking now, no one would listen." He shook his head. "It's not as simple as that, I'm afraid. Trouble is, once you start a thing, you get caught up and it all gets more complicated." He squatted on his haunches, picked up several small flints, threw them up and caught them on the back of his hand. When he had done this 4 times, He dribbled the flints through his fingers and said in a sad, hollow voice, "Aunt Sarah would say, what a tangled web we weave once we practice to deceive." "What's that got to do with it?" He looked at her, then stood up and sighed. "I've said things to Noah that I shouldn't and that I wouldn't like to get out, just to keep him quiet in the beginning, and then as a sort of game." "A game?" She was quite bewildered now. "A story, then. What about? If I told you you'd hate me, I hate myself. Because of a story? Stories can't hurt anyone. Lies can, though. If you tell lies." He looked at her desperately. "Please, Paul, don't ask me to tell you. I'd rather die, really." "You're always saying that." She thought for a moment. "Was it lies about me?" "No." "Will you tell me sometime?" He screwed his eyes up. "I might. Yes, I expect so." "That's not good enough." "I'll tell you before your next birthday. Promise?" "I promise." He spat on his finger, dried it on his jacket, then drew it across his throat with a gurgling sound. Although she continued to feel deeply injured and let Theo know it, pretending she hadn't heard whenever he spoke to her and being extra nice to Lily and George in his presence to make the point sharper, she couldn't keep it up. Theo was so quiet, so meek and withdrawn, that there was no fun in tormenting him, and besides, so much was happening just at this moment, the summer suddenly exploding like a firework into a sparkling burst of excitement. She had no time left to brood. The end of term first. A week later, the Sunday school treat to the sea in 2 hay wagons drawn by spruced-up shire horses, coats gleaming like satin. And then, at the beginning of August, the King's coronation. That was a perfect day from beginning to end. Trestle tables were set up in the square. The whole town had a huge meal of roast beef and plum pudding, and afterwards there were races and games in the big vicarage garden. Paul and Annie were among the girls chosen to dance round the maypole, wearing white dresses with fluttering ribbons, and Lily played the harmonium, brought out of the church hall for the occasion. George had too much beer with his beef and had to lie down most of the afternoon, but recovered in time for the fancy dress ball in the assembly rooms in the evening. One moment it seemed that the lovely evening would go on forever. The next, they were out in the still starry night going home. Paul said, "This is the best day of my life," and they all smiled at her. Aunt Harriet said, "Bless you, Paul, this is nothing. You just wait till you've seen a good harvest fair." George went harvesting, and Poll and Theo carried his dinner out in a basket and sometimes stayed to watch the field finished. As the cutter clattered round, the square of wheat in the middle grew smaller and smaller until the terrified rabbit sheltering there came shooting out, ears laid back, zigzagging wildly over the stubble while everyone shouted and chased them with sticks. Theo once caught a small rabbit, but Poll never did, and in the end the farmer gave her a dead one to take home to her mother. There was dust on its eyes and dark blood at the side of its mouth, and it stretched out across her arms, stiff and straight as if it was running still. Paul saw the farmer's wife watching and said, "Poor rabbit," in a sad voice, and stroked its long ears, and the farmer's wife smiled. They had rabbit stew for supper that night, fragrant with herbs from the garden. Theo said, "Smells almost as good as a gypsy stew. Do you know how gypsies cook hedgehogs? They roll them in clay and bake them in ashes, and the skin comes off with the clay, prickles and all, clean as a whistle." The gypsies came into town several days before the harvest fair and camped in the priory ruins. After the gypsies, the rest of the fair began to arrive, and the market square filled up with great wagons and caravans carrying tents and sideshows and merry-go-rounds. Some of the caravans were painted with pictures to show what was inside. Sword swallowers and fat ladies and two-headed calves. The fire-eater was the best. A giant dressed in red satin knee breeches and lace-ruffled shirt, sprouting yellow flame from his mouth. But when Poll and Theo hung around, hoping to see him, the only person who got down from the caravan was a short, bald man with a squint. The day of the fair, Poll woke up early and went mushrooming. The best mushrooms grew in a field that belonged to a notoriously bad-tempered farmer, but Poll was lucky this morning. She had a full basket by the time he appeared in the gateway, yelling and waving his stick. "Tan your backside for you if I catch you again!" he roared after her as she wriggled through the gap in the hedge. And when her heart had stopped pounding, she sang as she ran down the lane to show she wasn't scared by that rude, silly threat. Aunt Harriet had said he wouldn't dare lay a finger on respectable citizens. The back door was open, and Johnnie was sitting on the step in the sun. She gave him a handful of blackberries she had picked on the way home, and put the basket of mushrooms inside the kitchen. Then, hearing her mother's step on the stair, she darted into the garden before she could be asked to lay the table for breakfast. Halfway up the cinder path, she saw a twist of smoke rising from the summer house, and stopped dead. Aunt Sarah sometimes lit a fire there in winter, but rarely in summer, and never at this time of the morning. She waited a minute, feeling uncertain, then marched up and pushed the door open. An old man was sitting by the fire, roasting an onion stuck on the end of a knife. Poll said sternly, "Don't you know this place is private? What are you doing here?" He turned his head slowly. He had a stubbly grey beard and long hair so thin that his pink scalp showed through. He said, "I might ask you that. Who are you?" And Poll was so surprised that he didn't speak in broad Norfolk that she answered at once, and politely, "I'm Poll Greengrass. This summer house belongs to my aunt." "Oh," he said, "is that who you are?" and looked her up and down with an amused smile that made her feel oddly uncomfortable. "Since you're here, you can run an errand for me. Go and tell those great idle girls I'd like a good piece of fat belly pork for my breakfast." "Do you mean Aunt Sarah?" "Harriet will do just as well. Get along with you. Tell 'em I'm hungry." She backed away slowly, then ran down the path. She put Johnnie through the gate into his own garden and went to Aunt Sarah's kitchen. Both aunts were there. She said uncertainly, "There's a man in the summer house. He says he wants breakfast." To her amazement, they took this quite calmly. Aunt Sarah smiled, and Aunt Harriet said, "Oh, he's turned up again, has he? I thought it was about time. Last time anyone saw him, it was your father in London." Aunt Sarah said, "I believe James set him up for the winter. He's always been good in that way." They both spoke as if it was perfectly natural for an old tramp to spend the night in their summer house and then order his breakfast. Aunt Sarah rose from the table and went to the larder, and Aunt Harriet said to Poll, "Go and tell your mother. She might have some things of your father's he won't need any more. Tell her a pair of boots would be useful. They take the same size." "Boots for the tramp?" Her aunts looked at each other, and Aunt Sarah sighed. "I suppose that's what he must look like. Poor father. He's your grandfather, Poll. Grandpa Greengrass." Poll stared. Aunt Harriet said, "What's the open mouth for? Catching flies or a bus?" Poll closed her mouth, and her aunt went on briskly, "Since you don't seem to know, I'd best tell you. Some people are footloose, and your grandfather's one. He wanted to be an actor when he was a young man, but his father said there was no money in that, and apprenticed him to a stonemason. But a settled life didn't suit him, and he took to the road. He's happy that way, and he doesn't bother us often. That good enough for you?" Poll swallowed saliva and nodded. Several things that had not made sense before had fallen into place in her mind. Hidden under the table, sent there for naughtiness, she had heard her parents talking about Grandpa Greengrass. He had turned up at Rowland and Son the day the money was stolen, and Father had been afraid they would send the police after him because he looked like a tramp, so he took the blame on himself. By the time he was sure young Rowland had been the thief, the idea of going off to America had taken root in his mind. Theo had said he wanted adventure, but Mother had blamed Grandpa Greengrass. If she really felt like that, she wouldn't want to give him Father's old clothes. More likely she'd fly into one of her tempers and say, "I'll see him in hell first." But in fact she just sniffed when Poll told her and said, "Yes, of course, poor old fellow," and went straight upstairs. Poll waited in the kitchen, listening to drawers being opened and closed overhead, and then Theo came down, a bundle in his arms, and a queer grin on his face. She said, "What's the silly grin for?" And he put his fingers to his lips, warning her. He was still grinning as he followed her into the garden. As soon as he was sure no one could hear, he said, "That's one thing got rid of, those ghastly pink vests. I got them out of the camphor chest while Mother had her back turned." Poll giggled. "They'll be too small for him. They've stretched. They'll fit anyone. I hoped I'd grow out of them, but they grew with me. And when Mother put them away for the summer, she said they were good as new. I was scared I'd have to wear them the rest of my life." Poll and Theo put the bundle down inside the summer house. Grandpa Greengrass was sitting at Aunt Sarah's desk tucking into bread and bacon and tea. He had loosed his shirt in the front, and although his face and neck were dirty, the skin of his chest was white and smooth. She said, "We're going to have mushrooms for breakfast. I picked them this morning." He tipped his chair back and looked at the ceiling and yawned. Theo whispered, "Come away, Poll. He doesn't want to talk to us." Poll could see that. Her grandfather wasn't in the least interested in her or in Theo or in anyone in their family. He couldn't ever have been because he'd left them. To go off and leave Grandma Greengrass was one thing, because she was only his wife, no real blood relation. But he had gone off and left his own children, Aunt Sarah and Aunt Harriet and Uncle Edmund and Father, who were. But he was her relation too, her grandfather. And even if that didn't matter to him, it mattered to her. She'd never seen him before and might never see him again, never in her whole life. She wanted to do something to mark the occasion, but she couldn't think what. If only she had something to give him, a present of some kind or some money to spend. Father had given him money last winter, but another winter was coming and Father was in America, and she had no money. She had spent last Saturday's penny, and although Aunt Sarah and Mother had promised to give them all something to spend at the fair, they hadn't yet done so. That was a good thing in a way, because if she had it already, she would have felt bound to give it to him, and it would have been dreadful to be without money to spend at the fair. Then she thought of something. Such a marvellous idea that she laughed out loud. She ran out of the summer house, round the back, and sank onto her knees. The earth was loose, as if someone had been digging there recently, but she didn't understand why until she had the tin in her hand and took the lid off. There was nothing inside, except a few grains of dust. "It's gone," she said. "The gold's gone." "Yes," Theo said. He was standing behind her. She turned and looked up and saw his shamed, nervous grin. He said, "I was going to tell you." gave it to Noah, Poll said. And then, because Theo was staring at her so blankly, like a foreigner or a deaf person, repeated it louder. You gave all that gold to Noah Bug? It wasn't worth anything, Theo said. They were sitting on the log pile in the small arbour at the end of Aunt Sarah's garden, a good private place covered with willow and with its back to the summer house. Of course gold's worth something, Poll said, even a small piece. A gold sovereign's worth something, isn't it? Theo said patiently, Not gold leaf shavings, though. Why do you think Dad brought them home for us to make Christmas cards with? Just what was left over, that's all they were, sweepings off the floor. She gasped. But you said... I know what I said. I thought... He screwed up his face, trying to remember exactly what he had thought all those months ago. I really did think, just for a bit, that they must be worth something. Otherwise, why should Dad go off like that? It didn't make sense. I mean, I didn't know about Grandpa Greengrass then. He looked at her accusingly. You didn't tell me. I didn't know either, did I? Not that it was him who'd turned up, because I thought he was dead. She felt powerful and proud. She thought for a minute, pretending to be watching a spider in the willow branches over her head. When it plummeted down and hung spinning on its gossamer thread, she said sharply, Did Noah believe the gold was valuable then? Did you tell him it was? He nodded. Did he believe you? Not at first, I don't think. So I told him Dad had stolen it from the coach firm in London to make sure we had something to live on while he was away in America. I thought that made it sound more likely somehow. I don't think he believed me, or not altogether, but it was like a game. Half a game, anyway. And I suppose he didn't want to make trouble, so he decided to play it. He said, all right then, as long as I gave him a piece of gold every week, he'd keep his mouth shut about everything. It was a way of making friends, really, sharing a secret. Do you understand? He smiled at her wanly. If you don't now, you will when you're older. Poll was outraged. How old did he think she was? 5? She said, You mean you told him lies about Dad stealing gold for a game? She put her face so close to his that she could see her face in his eyes. He closed them as if to get rid of her and said, Daft, I see now. I told you it was something awful I'd done, that I'd die rather than tell you. Well, I'd rather die now. Don't ask me to pity you, Poll said witheringly. But she did all the same. He looked so despairing, and he was such a fool. She said, I suppose it's being so clever makes you so stupid. You get tangled up. Look at the mess you're in now. No more gold to give Noah, so what'll he do? What if he goes round telling everyone our father's a thief? But I said he was. That's what's important. What'll Mother think? And Aunt Sarah? Theo shivered and groaned. I wish I was dead. That wouldn't help much. If Noah was, it might. That's wicked, Poll. Why? He looked at her astonished face carefully, then sighed and said, No, it isn't. I mean, you're not wicked, just me. Poll said, You could give Noah your fare money. She paused. Mine too, if you like. He shook his head. That wouldn't help much. Not in the end. I've got to do something that'll stop him forever. He wrapped his arms round himself and sat huddled up as if he felt suddenly cold. His face grew pinched and determined. Poll said, We'd better go and have breakfast. I've been up for hours. I feel hollow. When they passed the summer house, Grandpa Greengrass was fast asleep in the chair, mouth open and snoring. But when Poll crept up and peeped in the window later that morning, he had packed up and gone. The long day passed. It was so hot. Mother made her lie down in the afternoon in case she got overheated. She never thought she would sleep, but she did. And when Aunt Harriet came to wake her, it was already half dark, and the fair music was coming in through her window. a magical tinny sound on the blue air. "Makes me feel young again," Aunt Harriet said. Her ruddy face was polished with pleasure. "Buck up, slow coach. We'll take Theo and go. We won't wait for the others." Theo went to see the fire-eater, and Poll paid 3 pence to see the tiniest woman in England. There was a toy house in the tent, and the tiniest woman peeped out of one of the windows. Poll paid her money and went round the back to shake hands with her. She had been bending down to look out of the window, but she was still much smaller than Poll, even when she stood up. A merry midget whose little hand was hard and horny as an old man's. She squeezed Poll's fingers and said, "God bless you, my darling." They went on the merry-go-round. Theo on a prancing horse with flaring red nostrils, and Poll on an ostrich. She saw her mother and shouted, "Look at me! Look at me!" and drummed her feet on the side of the ostrich. But the next time round, Mother had vanished. Theo cried out, "Look, Poll, look!" craning round so he almost fell off his horse. He was red-faced and crowing with laughter. "Look, Johnnie!" he screamed, and as the merry-go-round began to slow down, Poll saw their pig galloping past, Mother and George running after him. He was twisting and turning, a great lumbering, lolloping pig going mad with excitement as other people shouted and joined in the chase. "How'd he get out?" Theo said as he dropped from his horse to the still-moving platform, then to the ground. Poll was slower. By the time she was off the ostrich, she had lost sight of them all. She ran round the merry-go-round, crashed into someone who said, "Watch where you're going!" And when she looked up, she saw Noah Bug's pale eyes gleaming down at her. He held her by the shoulders, but she kicked his shin to make him let go and ran wildly on, shouting, "Johnnie! Oh, Johnnie!" He came charging towards her like a live cannonball, his pursuers behind him. Poll held out her arms to stop him, and he swerved, grunting, and shot through the open flap of a tent. There was a horrendous crescendo of squealing and shouting. The canvas sides of the tent shook and bulged, and then a huge woman with a straggling grey beard sprouting out of her face came thundering out, Johnnie apparently chasing her. George hurled himself on top of the pig. Johnnie thrashed about, trumpeting, but George hung on to his ears like grim death, and he stopped at last, exhausted and trembling. "Bloody pig!" George gasped, but everyone standing round was roaring with laughter, even the bearded lady. "Poor Johnnie," Poll said. "I expect he was lonely all by himself in the hen-house and came looking for us." She squatted down and fondled his ears. Noah Bug said, "That your famous pet pig?" He didn't seem angry because she had kicked him, but grinned at her in a friendly way when she looked up at him. Then his grin faded, and Poll saw he had seen Theo, who had pushed through the laughing crowd and was standing beside her. Theo gazed back at him steadily. Noah started grinning again. His gooseberry eyes roamed the circle of onlookers and rested on Mother. Poll said loudly and quickly, "I saw Johnnie from the merry-go-round. Did you see me? I was on the ostrich. It was lovely, like flying. Shall we take him home, Mother? I will if you like, but you better come too. He pays more attention to you." "No, I'll take him, unless you've had enough of the fair already. Come along, you bad pig." The crowd began to drift away now that the excitement was over, but Noah Bug was still there, watching Mother intently through his pale lashes. She said in a kindly voice, "How are you, Noah? Enjoying the fair?" Noah wriggled his shoulders and licked his lips nervously, as if gathering courage to speak. Poll was sure he was going to say something dreadful, give Theo away, and the full horror of what this would mean suddenly struck her. She pushed roughly in front of Noah and said, "Wasn't she funny, Mother? That voice! She sounded like Lady March. Do you think she's a woman with a beard or a man with a lady's voice? She's fat in the chest, but that could be stuffing." "Be quiet, Poll." Mother was frowning. She took Poll by the wrist and drew her away from the tent. "It's sad either way, the poor soul. I'm ashamed of you. She might have heard what you said. I've half a mind to make you come home with me to teach you good manners." "I'm sorry," Poll said. "I didn't think." "Then you should. People like that have feelings just like the rest of us." "Yes, Mother." When she had gone, a docile Johnnie trotting behind her, Poll giggled to herself and looked round for Theo, but there was no sign of him. No sign of Noah either, though Poll looked for them both for some time. Then she paid a penny and went into the tooth-pulling booth to watch a boy have a tooth out. He sat in a chair on a platform with a sheet round his neck. But when the man bent over him with the pincers, he turned his back on the audience, and another man played a loud tune on a trumpet so Poll couldn't hear if the boy cried or not. When he got out of the chair, he looked pale, and there was blood on his chin, but he smiled bravely, and everyone cheered him. George was outside the booth with a friend, looking at the notice that said, "Painless extractions by skilled operator." He said, "Hello, you bloodthirsty child, was that gruesome enough for you?" Poll was annoyed by his superior tone. She said, "I was just looking for Theo. I thought he might be there." "If you really want Theo, he went up the church path while you were watching that painless extraction." The bright moon washed the stone of the church and whitened the grass between the moving black patterns the trees threw upon it. In its clear light, the faces of the two boys turned towards her were drained of all colour. They looked like bleached linen. She said in a busy, cross voice, "There you are, Theo. I've been looking for you for ages." Theo said quietly, "Go away, Poll. Go back to the fair." She laughed awkwardly. "What are you doing here, Theo? Playing hide-and-seek?" He repeated in the same dead, even tone. "Go away, Poll," she shouted babyishly. "Not unless you say what you're doing." "None of your business. Noah and I have something to settle." He stared at her with those dark, stranger's eyes, and she was afraid suddenly. She tried to ignore it. How could she be frightened of Theo? She said, "You're not fighting. It's stupid to fight." But her voice trailed away, and the fear grew inside her. Noah shifted lumpishly from one foot to the other. He muttered, "She's bright. Let's give over." Theo shook his head. Noah said, "I don't want to go on. Never did." He sounded bewildered and plaintive. "It was you kept it up all along?" "It's got to be ended now," Theo said. "There's no other way." His voice was stretched and taut like a bowstring, Poll thought, and he knew he was dangerous. She whispered, "Noah," meaning to warn him. But he tittered unwisely, and Theo swung round with a hissing intake of breath, fists clenched, head flung back. Noah looked him up and down and then said impatiently, "I don't want to fight over nothing. Grow up, Greengrass, can't you?" And this echo of that long-ago taunt on the ice was the last straw for Theo. He gave a sharp cry and rushed at Noah, jabbing a foot behind his calf to throw him off balance. Noah reeled but recovered, and they wrestled together, panting and grunting and staggering in a kind of absurd drunken dance, their arms round each other. They were evenly matched now, the same height, the same weight. But Theo was wild with rage, and that gave him the advantage. He broke loose and punched Noah in the throat, a murderous blow that made Noah gurgle and gasp. Theo hit him again in the stomach, and Noah doubled over and fell. Theo kicked him as he lay crumpled against one of the tombstones. Poll saw Theo's face, pale and exultant and terrible, and shouted, "Stop! Oh, stop, Theo!" But although he turned his face briefly towards her, he took no notice of her anguished cry. He flung himself on top of Noah and fastened his hands round his neck. Poll saw Noah's head rolling limply as Theo shook him up and down. Whimpering, she wound her fingers in Theo's hair and tugged hard, digging her heels in the ground and throwing her weight back. He yelped and struck at her, but she hung on until she had dragged him off Noah. Then she let go and backed away, frightened. But Theo didn't come after her. He was standing still, staring down. He said, "Get up! Don't play the fool!" But Noah didn't move. He lay like a bundle of old clothes on the ground. His eyes were half closed, rolled up under the lids, his mouth drooping open. Poll said, "He looks dead." Theo said, "He can't be." He looked at Poll, and she saw horror dawn in his eyes. He said, "Why didn't you stop me? No one could stop you." He nodded and swallowed. The wind and the distant tune from the merry-go-round sighed in the tall trees above them. Poll said, "It wasn't Noah's fault, none of it. I don't mean just now, him not wanting to fight, but before. All that about the blackmail. Noah just teased you, that's all. You made the rest up." "I don't know," he said. "I don't know, it's all muddled." She said triumphantly, "You wanted a quarrel because he called you a runt. That's all it's been all the time. And now you've killed him because of it." Theo was watching her, fascinated. He said, "Poll!" But she started to cry. "Poor Noah," she sobbed. "Oh, poor Noah." Her tears fell like rain. Poor Noah, but poor Theo too. She gasped out, "Run, Theo, run away quickly before someone finds out, or they'll catch you and send you to prison." He said very bitterly, "Now that I know what you think of me, what a mean, shabby person I am, I'd rather stay, thank you, and just hope they'll catch me and hang me." This made her cry harder. Through a veil of tears, Theo's face wobbled in front of her. He said, "Listen, Poll, I can't run away, can't just leave him." She started to scream in little short bursts. Someone shouted, "Shut your bawling, you silly great mawther!" She stopped, choking. Noah was sitting up, grinning. She rubbed her eyes, but it was true, not a dream. She said, "You were only pretending." "Only way to stop him, weren't it?" He got up, feeling himself very carefully, as if wondering how many bones had been broken, then smiled slyly at Theo. "Took you in, didn't I?" Theo frowned. Poll was afraid he was going to say that he hadn't believed Noah was dead for a minute. It was only his stupid young sister. She said, "Theo was scared to death. We both were." Noah beamed. Theo smiled shakily. He said, "I'm sorry, Noah. Poll was right what she said. I made it all up, all what I told you." Noah thrust his hands deep in his pocket and swaggered, "Think I didn't know that? You're not the only person with brains." "No, I know that," Theo said humbly. Now it was over, he looked very sick. Noah said, "That's that then. I reckon we're square now. You bashed me up and I fooled you." He took his hand out of his pocket and offered it to Theo, who stepped forward and shook it. They looked at each other and laughed in what seemed to Poll a loud, stupid way. Even though they were not enemies now, they were too different to be friends, so it was silly of them to pretend they could be. She followed them back to the fair, feeling a little resentful because they went on ahead without once looking back at her, but too occupied with her thoughts to be really jealous. Theo had said she would understand what he'd done when she was older, but she understood now, and better than he did. Theo was clever, but he wasn't sensible like ordinary people, and it set him apart from them. Even Noah understood that. It was why he had been so magnanimous. Poll thought, Theo will always be lonely. And it made her feel proud and sad to know this, and very responsible. It was as if someone, a teacher or a clergyman or Aunt Sarah, had suddenly said to her, "Your brother will have a hard time all his life. You will have to look after him." She would have to do that, now she'd been asked, however angry she might sometimes get with him. Aunt Harriet was shouting at Mother. Hesitating at the back door, Poll heard her say, "I don't care what you say, Emily. Some children feel more than others, and that one wasn't raised in a cowpat." She swept out of the kitchen, almost falling over Johnnie and Poll on the step. She was huffing and puffing with temper, but when she saw Poll, she laughed her loud, mannish laugh and said, "Talk of the devil! Go and put on a clean frock. We're off out, you and I." She whisked off, skirts flying. Poll went indoors and said, "What was all that?" "Just your aunt having the last word, as usual." "What about? What child wasn't raised in a cowpat?" "Never you mind." Mother was pressing a dress, soaping the seams. The flat iron hissed as she banged it down harder than was really necessary, and her lips were compressed. She said without looking at Poll, "Your blue and white check will do, and a fresh petticoat. She's ordered the governor's cart from the Angel, so hurry up and don't keep her waiting." Aunt Harriet was at the door, the grey pony fidgeting. It had started to rain, big thundery drops, and with the gig umbrella up and the waterproof rug over their knees, they were warm and dry in their small house on wheels. Aunt Harriet did not seem disposed to talk, but by the time the rain had stopped and she had folded the umbrella and put it back in its holder, she seemed in fine spirits, and Poll dared to ask where they were going. "Mystery tour," Aunt Harriet said. "Wait and see." The governor's cart rattled through lanes dusty with summer and stopped outside a cottage with a slanting roof covered with roses and a green water butt outside the back door. A plump woman came running out and helped them down from the trap. She called Poll, "My chicken," and clasped her to her cushiony chest, scratching Poll's nose on a brooch, then released her and cried, "Harriet, what fun! You're just in time for tea." Outside the cottage door, in the sun, was a huge wooden box squirming with puppies. Their mother came forward to greet them, crouching belly to earth and showing white teeth in a smile. "She won't hurt you, my chicken," the plump lady said. "You can pick up her puppies." Poll was enchanted. 5 of the puppies were smooth-coated, like their mother. The 6th was covered with tight brown curls. When Poll picked him up, he was heavy and warm in her arms, his soft stomach firm as a drum. "He'll make a fine dog, that one," his owner said. "All the others are bitches." "First things first, though. You'll be hungry after your journey." Poll set the puppy down and he stumbled back to the box on short, splayed-out legs, crying for his mother. Tea was laid on a table under an apple tree. They ate bread and butter and blackberries and damp harvest cake. Aunt Harriet said, "We can't stay too long, Hetty. Better pass the time of the day with the old fellow before we go, I suppose. How's he been?" Hetty didn't answer for a minute. Poll saw her round face grow sober and somehow chilled under her flaming hair, as if the sun had gone in. She said, "No better, nor will be this side the grave." And Aunt Harriet put her hand out over the table, and Hetty clasped it. They got up and carried the tea things indoors. Poll offered to help, but Aunt Harriet told her to play with the puppies, and she guessed that the old fellow, whoever he was, disliked children. She tickled the puppies. The curly one decided her hand was a good toy to play with, and attacked it in short, prancing rushes, his little teeth sharp as needles. She laughed and wiggled her fingers, and he stalked them, stiff-legged, growling like a small engine. "Like to take him home, Poll?" Aunt Harriet said. "Birthday present?" Poll's birthday had been 2 weeks earlier. Mother had given her a satchel, Theo and Lily a blue china duck full of chocolates, and George had made her a pop gun from an alder stick with the pith removed that shot acorns or small balls of wet paper as ammunition, and the aunts had given her gauntlet gloves for the winter. Had Aunt Harriet forgotten? She said reluctantly, "You gave me those gloves." Aunt Harriet laughed. "Do you want him, or don't you?" Poll felt giddy with happiness. She was too full to speak. As they set off down the lane, she felt ashamed. She managed to whisper, I didn't say thank you.
Your face was enough, I dare say, Harriet said rather shortly.
Paul thought she seemed sad about something. She said, "Is your friend's husband ill?" And Aunt Harriet nodded.
"Dying, a miserable man, and punishing poor Hetty for it. Hates her, because she's living and breathing, and he won't be much longer. If I were her, I'd tell him a thing or two, but she's too soft-hearted. It's always the soft ones get hurt in this world, and it hurts the rest of us watching them."
She looked at Paul.
"Thought of a name for your puppy?"
Paul shook her head.
"Hetty's a Scotswoman. Hetty McGregor. Why not call him Mac?"
Paul tried it out. "Mac?" she said.
And the curly puppy wriggled excitedly and buried his cold little nose in her neck. Mother put a saucer of milk on the hearth. Mac started to lap, but stopped when Johnnie came to investigate. The huge pig terrified him. He staggered back to Paul, squeaking, and tried to climb up her legs. "Go away, Johnnie, you've scared him," Paul said. "Poor old Johnnie," George said. "He was here first. Come here, poor old pig. She doesn't want you." He sat down and scratched Johnnie's neck and blew into his ears until he grunted with pleasure. She noticed, the next day or two, that George made more fuss of Johnnie than he had done for ages. He had often complained that the pig took up too much room and was always occupying the hearth when he wanted to stretch his long legs out. Now he not only didn't complain, but came home every day with some titbit for Johnnie, an apple or a handful of acorns. Paul began to think that even if George wasn't jealous on his own behalf, he might be jealous for Johnnie, now she had the puppy. A week later, something happened that made her quite sure of it. Breakfast was over, and she was having a last game with Mac before she went off to school, throwing a cotton reel on a string for him to pounce on with fierce little growls, when George said, "What about saying goodbye to Johnnie before you go, Paul?" And when she looked up, surprised, "Well, poor old pig, you've been neglecting him lately," she said. "Don't be stupid." But he had made her feel guilty. She loved Johnnie, of course she did. But he was old and fat now, and Mac was much more fun to play with. She picked up her satchel and went up the garden to make amends. But although the hen-house was open, he didn't come trotting eagerly out as he always did. Mother was at the back door. "Hurry up, you'll be late. Annie's come for you," she said. "Johnnie!" impatiently, but he still didn't come out of the hen-house. Mother frowned as she kissed Paul. "First time he's not come out when he's been called in his life." "Just lazy," Paul said. She shouted, "Goodbye, you lazy old pig," and ran off to school. And when she came back, he was gone. She hadn't known. For the rest of her life she was sure she hadn't known, and yet, when she came home, she knew what had happened before anyone told her. She was late for tea. She came in with Annie, their pockets full of acorns they had collected for Johnnie, and her family was at the table already. Lily and George and Theo and Mother, with Mac on her lap. Only one missing. She said, "Where's Johnnie?" And in her heart knew the answer. Mother said, "Oh, Paul." There were tears in her eyes. Paul's tongue was clumsy and dry in her mouth. "Where's he gone?" Mother shook her head, apparently speechless. She put Mac down and went to the dresser to get a plate for Annie. Lily was braver. "He went to the butcher this morning." Paul said nothing. Lily said, "Darling Paul, we couldn't keep him forever. Great pig eating his head off. You knew that, didn't you?" "I don't think she did." George's voice shook with anger. He looked at his mother, accusing her. "You should have explained." Oh, that was wicked."
"Shut up, George," Lily said.
Mother put the cup and plate on the table and sat down again. She said pitifully,
"It never seemed the right time. She was so ill, and then it got harder. I was sure she must know. All her friends keep pigs, don't they? You've got a pig, haven't you, Annie?"
Poll said slowly,
"Johnnie was different. You always said he was different."
"I told you, Mother," George said.
She looked at Poll. "I'm sorry. I truly am sorry. It's been hard for us all. We all loved the old pig."
Her voice trailed away. Her head drooped, but she lifted it with an effort, smiling sadly.
"I should have talked to you, Poll, but I thought, well, I thought it might be easier for you this way. For me too, I suppose. You know what you are. I'm sorry if I was wrong, and I hope you'll forgive me. Sit down now and have tea."
Poll shook her head. George said, "I don't suppose she's exactly hungry. I know I'm not. And I know another thing, too. I'll never eat bacon again as long as I live."
"I'm going to be sick," Theo said.
He got off his chair and ran from the table.
"Nor
"Pork neither," George raged, "nor sausage. If any bit of Johnnie comes into this house, even so much as a trotter, I'll never eat at this table again. I'll leave home, so help me, and go to Australia."
Lily said coldly, "There's not much chance of your eating Johnnie, George. We owe the butcher."
"Oh." George looked down at his plate. He muttered, "I didn't know."
"Well, you know now," Lily said. "How do you think poor Mother's been managing? Have you ever asked? I've not noticed you holding back."
George was silent.
"Just like a man,"
Lily snorted, and went round the table and put her arm round her mother. Mother took her hand and held it against her cheek. George cleared his throat. "I could have left school. I could have got a job and brought money home." Mother whispered,
"Your education is important, dear. Sarah thinks you may get into Cambridge."
"To hell with Cambridge," George said. "To hell with Aunt Sarah." No one answered that shocking remark. Mother patted Lily's hand and sat straight in her chair. Lily went back to her seat and poured tea. She said,
"Even if Paul isn't hungry, perhaps Annie is. Sit down, Annie."
Lily didn't look at Poll. None of them looked at her. Poll moistened her lips and said in a soft, amazed voice,
"Annie said Johnnie was different. Everyone said he was different."
She sat on the log pile at the end of Aunt Sarah's garden. She stared straight ahead of her. Her eyes were hot and dry, the burning lump in her throat too solid for tears. When Annie came, finally, she made room for her on the logs, but took no more notice of her. After a while, Annie said,
"I don't like it when our pigs get killed either,"
and added after a pause,
"But it's always plenty to eat, pig-killing time."
Poll looked at her then.
Annie's face was thin like her mother's. She said timidly, "Are you angry, Poll?"
"Not with you," Poll said, and knew suddenly that she wasn't angry with anyone. She had thought for a bit that she hated her mother, but there was no point in that. People ate pigs, and so pigs had to be killed. If they weren't, people went hungry. Annie said, "I got a bit of cake for you, Poll. Do you want it?"
"Thank you," Poll said.
She ate the cake, every crumb, because Annie had brought it, but it tasted like ashes. She ate no supper that evening, no breakfast the next day, no midday dinner. Lily came to her room after she'd gone to bed and said,
"Please, Poll,
You haven't eaten for days. Don't punish Mother this way. It's so cruel. Poll said, I'm not. I can't eat. Not won't. Will you drink a glass of milk, then? She brought the milk, and Poll tried to drink it, but the first sip made her gag. Lily took the glass as she doubled up, retching. My insides closed up, she sobbed. Really, Lily? Aunt Sarah took her for a walk. She was weak because she had not eaten for 7 days, and was glad to hold Aunt Sarah's hand. They went down Station Street, and Aunt Sarah stopped in front of the butcher's and said, Look, my dear. Those are dead creatures hanging there, and you must face up to it. They have to be killed so that human beings can live and grow strong. We are carnivorous animals. Do you know what that means? Yes, Poll said. We eat meat. And fainted dead away. She rather enjoyed all the fuss. Someone bathed her forehead with water, and when she got home she lay on the old sofa in the front room, and George brought Mac to amuse her. George said, You should take him for a walk. The poor chap needs exercise. There's a blue leather collar and lead in the Saddlers. You could buy that. I haven't got any money. Earn some, then. George laughed, as if a bright idea had just struck him. Tell you what. You eat this pear and I'll give you 2pence. George said, We could draw up a scale of charges. 2pence for a pear, 3pence for a glass of milk, 6pence if you eat a whole plate of dinner. Though you'll have to work up to that gradually or you'll make yourself ill. People's stomachs shrink when they've been starved for a bit. She ate the pear, and George gave her 2 shiny new pennies. The next day she had another pear, and a glass of milk, and a sticky bun, which made 7pence altogether. She ate her dinner, and George paid her 8pence for that, because she had a second helping of pudding. By the time she had earned enough to pay for the collar, she had begun to feel ordinarily hungry again, and went on eating without being paid, because George said he had run out of money. The collar fitted the puppy, and although he hated being on a lead to begin with, sitting down front paws braced when she tried to get him to walk, she coaxed him gently, and quite soon he was scampering along, dragging her after him until she was quite out of breath. Silly dog, she scolded. Why can't you be sensible and walk to heel like old Johnnie? Mother said, Pigs have more brains than dogs, didn't I tell you? The walnuts were ripe in the avenue at the back of the church. An old woman sat there during the week to chase the boys off, but on Sundays she stayed at home, and after church they lagged behind their aunts and their mother and filled their pockets when no one was looking. Lily said, Dad likes walnuts. We'd better save some for him. I wonder if he'll be home in time to see me in the school play. Oh, I do hope so. Why are you pulling that face, Poll? I'm not pulling a face. Yes, you are. No, I am not, Lily said angrily. Do you think I'm not going to be worth seeing? Is that it? No, of course not. But it was partly that. It seemed to Poll, suddenly, that everyone was always looking forward to something wonderful that might never happen. Lily to being a famous actress, Mother to Dad coming home, Theo to being grown up, not an odd and lonely little boy, but a person with friends, Father to making his fortune. It was a dangerous way to go on. The only safe things to be happy about were things that were over and gone. Poll felt cold, as if she had been turned to cold stone. What's the matter? George said. Then more urgently, What's the matter, Poll? They were all staring at her. She couldn't speak. Aunt Sarah had stopped and was coming back. She said, What's wrong with you, Poll? You look as if you'd seen a ghost. I can't move, Poll whispered. If she took one more step, something dreadful would happen. Go on, Aunt Sarah said to the others. She knelt in the dust in her best dress and put her arms round Poll. Poll leaned against her. After a minute, Aunt Sarah said, "Just growing pains. That's all that's wrong with you." Poll said, all this looking forward." She couldn't explain more than that, but it was no good telling Aunt Sarah. She was worse than anyone, looking into the future and hoping so much for them all. "I'm frightened," she said. "Oh, you have to be brave to look forward," Aunt Sarah said. "Come on now, hold my hand." She stood up and brushed her dress down and looked at Poll keenly, as if she saw into her mind. "Things do go right sometimes," she said. And one most important thing did. Poll went out to tea one day after school, and when she came home, Father was sitting by the fire, cracking walnuts. She stood in the doorway and stared. For a second he looked like a stranger, quite an old man with grey in his hair. And the next he was just as he had been before he went away. He held out his arms, and she ran and sat on his lap and hid her face in his shoulder. He said, "Oh, my baby." But she couldn't speak. She was too embarrassed even to look at him, and he held her tight and went on talking. They were all talking. She heard his voice and Mother's and George's and Lily's and Theo's, all running into and over each other like instruments in an orchestra playing a fine, happy tune. Father's fingers stroked the back of her head, feeling the bone of her skull and the hollow at the back of her neck in the way he had always done. She had begun to feel foolish sitting there with her face hidden, but dared not look up in case they all laughed at her. At last Mother said, "Lily, come into the scullery and help me get supper. I want some potatoes peeled. George, you've got homework, haven't you? Take it into the front room and get on with it, and don't waste any more time. And Theo, you run next door and tell them Father's ship docked earlier than expected, and he decided to turn up without sending a telegram just to catch us all on the hop. Isn't that typical?" Doors closed. Silence, except for the creep and hiss of the fire and small squeaky sounds as Mac dreamed in his basket. Father lifted her head away from his shoulder and said, "Well, what's been happening to you?" She tried to think. So much. But she could only remember one thing. A little pig sitting in a pint beer mug and squealing. A bigger pig trotting behind Mother when she went shopping. A naughty pig stealing hot cross buns and next door's gooseberries. A famous pig, the talk of the town, sitting good as gold in the drawing-room of the manor house with his head in his hostess's lap. A portly pig, snoozing on the doorstep in the sun. Johnnie, the Peppermint Pig, gone now like this whole long year of her life, but fixed and safe in her mind for ever and ever. She said, "Johnnie's dead." Father looked at her, puzzled but smiling. He cupped her chin in his hand and said, "My darling, who's Johnnie?"